Hey there and welcome back. If you're getting cozy right now, perhaps the lights have gone soft. The room is settling into its evening quiet and you have something warm to hand, then settle in and let your shoulders drop. Because tonight's story is one of those that wants you patient, wants you steady, and wants you somewhere comfortable enough to take in a long, slow account of one of the most extraordinary scandals in modern British history. Tonight we are going to spend several hours with a woman who is, by any reasonable standard, one of the most badly served and most thoroughly fascinating figures of the Regency era. She was born a German princess in a small North German court in 1768. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one, whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history. I'm glad you're with me. She married, at the age of 27, the heir to the British throne, in a wedding that was conducted by a drunk groom, who, by his own later admission, spent the wedding night on the bedroom floor. She had a single daughter by him within 9 months of the wedding, and that daughter was the only child she would ever have. She was separated from her husband within months of the wedding. She was investigated, in 1806, by a secret commission of senior politicians inquiring into whether she had borne an illegitimate child. She was eventually allowed to leave England in 1814, and she conducted in continental Europe a tour of Italy and the Eastern Mediterranean in the company of a tall Italian courier whose status in her household became, over the years that followed, a matter of intense diplomatic interest and considerable popular gossip. She returned to England in 1820 when her husband became King George IV in order to claim her rights as Queen Consort. She was met on her return by enormous popular crowds who cheered her in Dover and in London with a fervour that the country had not directed toward any royal personage for generations. Her husband, the new king, attempted to divorce her by means of a parliamentary bill which produced one of the most spectacular legal proceedings in British history, with Italian witnesses brought to London to give testimony about her domestic arrangements abroad, and with her defence conducted by the most brilliant barrister of the age, and with the whole of London every day for months, watching the unfolding drama with an attention that was reported, at the time, as something close to obsession. The bill failed narrowly. She was, briefly, the most popular figure in England. Then, on the day of her husband's coronation in July of 1821, she went to Westminster Abbey to attempt to take her place as Queen at his crowning, and she was turned away at the door, in front of thousands of spectators, in a humiliation that was, in its public completeness, almost without precedent in British royal history. She died 3 weeks later, after a brief illness, at the age of 53. Her body was returned to her native Brunswick. She was, in the manner of her death and funeral procession through London, the source of yet one more public disturbance, with crowds rioting in the streets to ensure that her coffin took the route through London that the government had wished to deny it. This is the story of Caroline of Brunswick, the Princess of Wales, then the Queen Consort, then the woman whose name was struck from the Anglican prayer book by order of her husband shortly after her death, then, in due course, the figure who became one of the most studied and reconsidered subjects of 19th century British history. She was, by every standard applied to royal women of her era, a difficult and unconventional person. She was also, by every standard applied to the men who were responsible for her treatment, the victim of a consistent and decades-long campaign of cruelty conducted by a husband who never wanted her, never tried to make the marriage work, and never accepted any responsibility for the situation in which he had placed her. She is one of the most genuinely interesting figures of the period, and she has, in recent decades, been the subject of a serious historical reconsideration that has tended to be considerably more sympathetic to her than the contemporary judgments of her enemies were. The story we are going to tell tonight is, in its broadest outlines, the story of a woman who was given an impossible situation and who responded to it with a combination of eccentricity, bravery, vulgarity, courage, indiscretion, kindness, and bad judgment in roughly equal proportions over a period of decades. She was not always wise. She was not always discreet, but she was, throughout, a real person, and her story, taken in its full extent, is one of the most human and most affecting royal stories of the 19th century. So get comfortable. Pour yourself, if you are inclined, something warm. Let your eyes close if they want to, and let me take you slowly and patiently through the long, extraordinary life of Caroline of Brunswick, from her birth in a small German court in 1768 to her death in a London bedroom in 1821, with all the strange and dramatic episodes that came between. We will begin where she began, in a North German principality called Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, in the late summer of 1768, in a court that was, by the standards of its period, neither particularly splendid nor particularly modest, but that was, in its own way, a genuine miniature of the kind of small German principalities that supplied so many of the brides and bridegrooms of the European royal houses through the 18th and 19th centuries. Caroline Amalie Elizabeth of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel was born on the 17th of May, 1768. Her father was Charles William Ferdinand, the hereditary Prince of Brunswick, who would in due course succeed his own father as the reigning duke. He was, at the time of Caroline's birth, 23 years old, a man of considerable military talent and considerable personal vanity, who had been brought up to expect the inheritance of a small but respected German duchy, and who would, in time, become one of the most distinguished German military commanders of the late 18th century. He would lead the Prussian forces against revolutionary France in the early 1790s, with mixed results. He would, eventually, in 1806, be mortally wounded at the Battle of Auerstedt, fighting against Napoleon. He was, throughout his life, a man of strong personality and considerable physical courage, although his marriage to Caroline's mother was not by any honest account a successful one. Caroline's mother was Princess Augusta of Great Britain. She was the elder sister of King George III of England. She had been born in 1737 in London, and she had been, in her early years, something of a favourite of her grandfather King George II, although her own father Frederick Prince of Wales had died young and her relationship with her younger brother King George III had become in adulthood increasingly distant. She had married the hereditary Prince of Brunswick in January of 1764 in a marriage of considerable diplomatic significance, designed to strengthen the connection between the Hanoverian electorate, which the British monarchs continued to hold, and the various smaller German principalities that lay around it. Augusta had moved to Brunswick at the age of 26. She had brought with her, by all accounts, a certain English seriousness that the Brunswick court found rather uncongenial. She had not adapted well to her German setting. She had not been particularly happy in her marriage, and she had, by 1768, when Caroline was born, settled into a kind of unhappy semi-detachment from her husband and from the court around him, conducting her life with her children and her household and her correspondence, while her husband conducted his life with his military duties and his various mistresses, and the two of them, although they continued to occupy the same official residence, lived for the most part separately. This was the household into which Caroline of Brunswick was born. A small German court of moderate splendour, a father of considerable personality who was largely absent, either with his troops or with his women, mother of English background who was unhappy in her marriage and who found her primary consolation in her children and in her connections to the family she had left behind in England, an array of older siblings of whom the eldest brother Charles would in due course become the next Duke of Brunswick, and the next eldest, also a brother, was developmentally disabled and would not be able to succeed his father, and the older sister Augusta would in due course marry the King of Württemberg in a marriage that turned out to be even more disastrous than the marriages that lay in store for her younger sister. Caroline herself, born in 1768, was the fourth of 6 children that her mother eventually produced, and she was, by the conventions of the German princely households of the period, raised in a way that would equip her for the kind of marriage that her mother's English connections were eventually expected to produce for her. Quickened, her childhood, by the various surviving accounts, was a strange one. She was a vigorous and active child by all reports, with strong opinions and strong feelings and a vivid personality. She was not, in the standard sense, a particularly well-behaved child. She did not conform easily to the rigid protocols of her mother's English-style household. She was prone to outbursts of temper, to bursts of laughter at inappropriate moments, to acts of small rebellion against her governesses and her tutors. She was, however, also a warm-hearted and affectionate child, with a particular kindness toward animals and toward children younger than herself, and with a generous and open temperament that made her, despite her difficulties, a generally well-liked figure in the Brunswick court. She was, by the standards of the German princely education of the period, indifferently educated. She learned to speak French, which was the standard court language of 18th century Europe, and she learned a certain amount of English from her mother and from various English visitors. She learned the German of her own court, although her mother's preference for English in the family setting meant that her German was, in adulthood, slightly less refined than her French or her English. She learned music in a way, although she was not by any account a particularly gifted musician. She learned drawing, again in a moderate way. She learned a great deal about needlework and about the various other small accomplishments that German princesses of the period were expected to acquire. She learned, by the rough and ready training of her mother's household, the basics of English literature and of the kind of polite reading that English aristocratic women of the 18th century could be expected to undertake, but she was not, in the true sense, well educated. She had not had the kind of careful, systematic instruction that some of the more conscientious German courts gave to their daughters. She had been allowed to grow up, more or less, with her own enthusiasms and her own inclinations, and she had emerged, by the time she was in her 20s, as a young woman of considerable warmth and considerable energy and considerable indiscretion. Her appearance was the subject of various contemporary descriptions, which agree, in the broad outline, that she was not particularly beautiful but was striking in her own way. She had blue eyes. She had blonde hair, which was her best feature, and which she wore in the conventional manner of the period, dressed and powdered for formal occasions. She was of medium height, with a tendency to stoutness that became more pronounced in her later years. She had, by the standards of late 18th century court taste, a kind of healthy, florid colouring that was not particularly fashionable. She was in her early 20s, lively and full-figured, with the kind of physical vitality that made her, in the moments when she was animated by some interest, attractive in a way that the more delicate and more decorous beauties of her court could not match. She was also, however, in moments of repose, somewhat plain. Her personality, by all the surviving accounts of those who knew her in Brunswick, was the most striking thing about her. She was intelligent, although not in any conventional sense educated. She was warm, although her warmth was sometimes expressed in ways that made other people uncomfortable. She was generous, although her generosity was sometimes indiscriminate. She was indiscreet. She was prone to making jokes that more careful people would have suppressed. She had a particular fondness throughout her life for children and for animals and for people of humble station, and she was inclined to treat all of them with a kind of egalitarian friendliness that was not, by the standards of the period, considered appropriate for a princess of the blood. She was also, by the standards of late 18th century European royalty, considered to be in some way unsuitable for marriage. The reasons for this were several. Her court reputation, although not actually scandalous, was thought to be, in some indefinable way, lacking in dignity. Her mother had been, throughout her childhood, particularly anxious about her behaviour and had supervised her with a strictness that the various foreign visitors to Brunswick in the 1780s and early 1790s sometimes remarked on as excessive. Her father had been, in his various visits home from his military duties, alternately indulgent and severe, with a tendency to laugh at his daughter's most inappropriate jokes that was thought, in the more conservative quarters of the court, to be encouraging precisely the behaviour that her mother was trying to suppress. By the early 1790s, when she was approaching her mid-20s, the question of her marriage had begun to be a real one in the Brunswick court. She was, by the standards of the period, getting on in age for an unmarried princess. The available pool of suitable royal husbands was, by the standards of late 18th century Europe, becoming complicated by the upheavals of the French Revolution and the various wars that followed it, and her own personal reputation, although nothing definite had ever been alleged against her, was thought to be, in some quarters, an obstacle to her making the kind of dynastic marriage that her position required. Various candidates were considered. The Margrave of Ansbach was discussed and rejected. The Prince of Orange was considered, and the negotiations broke down. Several minor German princes were proposed and dropped for various reasons. The marriage market for a princess of Caroline's particular profile was not entirely promising. Then, in the autumn of 1794, an offer arrived from a quarter that nobody in Brunswick had quite expected. The Prince of Wales of Great Britain, the eldest son of King George III and the heir to the British throne, was looking for a wife. The circumstances of this offer require some explanation, because they are essential to understanding everything that followed, and because the marriage of the Prince of Wales to Caroline of Brunswick was, from the moment it was first proposed, one of the most cynical and badly thought-through dynastic arrangements of the entire late 18th century. The Prince of Wales, who had been born in 1762, and who was therefore, by the autumn of 1794, 32 years old, was the heir apparent to the throne of the United Kingdom and the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. He had been brought up, in the strict pious household of his father, with all the formal seriousness that his position required. He had also been brought up with all the rigid restrictions that his father's particular brand of household discipline imposed on the royal children, and he had emerged in his late teens and early 20s as a young man whose response to that upbringing had been to develop, in his own person, almost every habit and inclination that his parents had most disapproved of. He had become, by his mid-20s, the most extravagant, the most dissipated, and the most expensive heir to the throne in modern British memory. He had built, at considerable public cost, an enormous palace on the site of what is now Carlton House Terrace in London, which he had decorated to a standard of luxury that the English public found by turns magnificent and outrageous. He had built, on a smaller but equally lavish scale, the pavilion at Brighton in a style of Oriental fantasy that was, even by the relaxed aesthetic standards of late Georgian taste, considered eccentric. He had accumulated debts on a scale that ran into hundreds of thousands of pounds, which in the values of the period represented a sum that was simply uncoverable from his own income, and that required periodically a parliamentary intervention to clear. He had conducted, throughout his 20s, a series of love affairs with various aristocratic and theatrical women, of whom several had become subjects of public gossip, and one had become the subject of a serious constitutional crisis. He had, in 1785, gone through a secret marriage ceremony with a Roman Catholic widow named Maria Ann Fitzherbert, whom he had pursued with such passionate persistence that she had only consented to his pursuit on the condition of marriage, even though both of them knew that the marriage conducted in defiance of the Royal Marriages Act of 1772 was legally void. He had, in the years following that secret marriage, conducted his life with Mrs. Fitzherbert as the central but not the sole female presence in his domestic arrangements, and the relationship had become, by the early 1790s an open secret of London society, although it was never officially acknowledged. By 1794, however, the Prince of Wales had a problem that no amount of expensive entertainment and no amount of romantic intrigue could solve. Its debts had become genuinely unmanageable. By the autumn of that year, he owed something close to £600,000, which was, in the money of the period, a fortune of staggering proportions, and his creditors were beginning to lose patience. The standard solution to royal debt in the 18th century, when the personal income of the prince was insufficient and Parliament was reluctant to increase the civil list provision, was for the prince to marry. A royal wedding was, by the conventions of the period, an occasion on which Parliament would consent to a substantial increase in the prince's annual income, and would also often consent to clearing his accumulated debts as a one-time settlement. The Prince of Wales, who had resisted the idea of marriage for many years, was finally persuaded, in the summer of 1794, that there was no other practical way out of his financial difficulties. The choice of bride, given the political circumstances of late 1794, was a constrained one. The candidates had to be Protestant. They had to be of royal or quasi-royal birth, suitable in dynastic terms. They had to be available, which meant that they could not be already married or otherwise committed, and they had to be acceptable to the prince's parents, particularly to King George III, who would have to give his formal consent to the marriage under the terms of the Royal Marriages Act. The prince himself, by all accounts, was not particularly engaged with the question. He had agreed, reluctantly, that he would marry. He had not particularly cared whom he would marry. The negotiations were conducted, in his absence, by his political advisers and by the various diplomatic channels that linked the British court to the small Protestant German principalities that were the natural source of brides for British heirs apparent. In this context, two main candidates emerged. The first was Princess Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who was a niece of Queen Charlotte and who was in many ways the more sensible choice. She was young, attractive, well-educated, and well-connected. She had been considered in earlier years for the Prince of Wales, although the discussions had not advanced beyond the preliminary stage. The second was Princess Caroline of Brunswick, who was the daughter of Princess Augusta and was therefore the niece of King George III himself. She was, in dynastic terms, an entirely suitable candidate. She was the right age, broadly speaking. She was Protestant. She was of royal blood, both through her father's house and through her mother's. She was, in personal terms, less obviously suitable than Princess Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, but she had one critical advantage, which was that her uncle the king favoured her. The king had, throughout his reign, taken a particular interest in his sister's daughter, and he had, by 1794, become convinced that Caroline of Brunswick was the right choice for his eldest son. The Prince of Wales, when consulted on the matter, agreed to the choice without any particular interest. He had, by the autumn of 1794, accepted the principle of marriage as a financial necessity, and he was not inclined to spend much time choosing among the available candidates. His personal life would, he assumed, continue with Mrs. Fitzherbert, and with whichever other women might engage his interest from time to time. The marriage to Caroline would be a public formality, designed to clear his debts and to produce, in due course, a legitimate heir. He was prepared to go through with it. He was not prepared to attach to it any particular emotional weight. There was, however, one circumstance that should have given everyone involved more pause than it did. The Prince of Wales had, by 1794, become romantically and sexually involved with a woman named Frances Villiers, the Countess of Jersey. She was a married woman in her early 40s, with a husband of some social standing and with several grown children. She was a woman of considerable charm and considerable manipulative skill, and she had, by various reports, formed the view that her own position with the Prince of Wales would be considerably strengthened if his eventual wife was a person of unattractive habits and limited social skills, who would not present a serious threat to her own influence. The role of Lady Jersey in the choice of Caroline of Brunswick has been debated by historians, but the broad outline is reasonably clear. She had, by the autumn of 1794, become a significant influence on the Prince of Wales. She had, by various accounts, encouraged him in his initial reluctance to marry, and then, when the financial pressures had made marriage inevitable, encouraged him to choose a bride who would be the least likely to displace her own position in his affections. Caroline of Brunswick, whose reputation had reached London in the form of various uncomplimentary descriptions of her boisterousness and her indiscretion, fitted Lady Jersey's requirements perfectly. The Prince of Wales, in agreeing to the choice of Caroline, was therefore choosing a wife whom his current mistress had, in effect, helped to select for him. The implications of this for the marriage that followed were considerable. In any case, the decision was made. In the autumn of 1794, an emissary was dispatched from London to Brunswick in the person of James Harris, the first Earl of Malmesbury, who was one of the most experienced British diplomats of his generation. His mission was to formally request the hand of Princess Caroline of Brunswick on behalf of the Prince of Wales, to negotiate the marriage settlement and to escort the princess from Brunswick to England in time for a wedding that was provisionally scheduled for the spring of 1795. Lord Malmesbury arrived in Brunswick in November of 1794. He was a man of considerable shrewdness and considerable diplomatic experience, and he had, by the time he reached Brunswick, formed a reasonably realistic view of what was likely to be involved in his mission. He was, however, somewhat unprepared for what he actually found when he met the woman he had been sent to escort to England. His diary of the months that followed, which was published many years later, and which survives as one of the most important documentary sources for the early life of Caroline of Brunswick, records his impressions in a way that gives us our first reliable independent picture of what she was like in the months before her marriage. He found her, he reported, to be a young woman of considerable natural good qualities, but of profoundly inadequate education and even more profoundly inadequate manners. She was, he wrote, naturally cheerful and good-natured, but entirely lacking in the kind of formal training that would have made her suitable for the position she was being asked to take up. She was indiscreet to a degree that made her unsuitable for any kind of court society. She was, by his observation, careless of her personal hygiene to a standard that was unusual even by the relatively relaxed standards of late 18th century German court life. She was, in particular, lacking in the kind of cultivated reserve that would have allowed her to manage the various delicate situations she was about to encounter. Lord Malmesbury, in the months he spent in Brunswick before escorting Caroline to England, conducted what was, in effect, a desperate course of training in basic court manners. He spoke to her repeatedly about the importance of personal cleanliness. She listened, by his account, with considerable goodwill, and she promised repeatedly that she would do better. But she did not, in fact, do better by any meaningful measure, and the months in Brunswick passed with Lord Malmesbury becoming increasingly anxious about what he was about to deliver to the British court. He also, however, formed a personal liking for her in a way that several of his successors in the management of her affairs also did. She was, he reported, a person of fundamental warmth and good intentions, who was being placed in a position that was almost certainly beyond her capacity to manage well. He felt sorry for her. Even before her departure from Brunswick, he wrote in his diary that he was concerned for what would happen to her in England. He was right to be concerned. The journey from Brunswick to England, in the early months of 1795, was itself a complicated and difficult one. The continent of Europe was at war. The French revolutionary armies were advancing on multiple fronts. The land route from Brunswick to the North Sea coast had to be planned with considerable care to avoid the various theatres of military operation. Lord Malmesbury and his small party, with the princess and her ladies-in-waiting and her baggage, set out from Brunswick in late December of 1794, and they spent several months working their way slowly toward the Dutch coast, with various delays and detours imposed by the military situation. They were at one point stranded at a small German town for several weeks while the route ahead was reconsidered. They eventually reached the Dutch coast in March of 1795. They embarked on a British naval vessel that had been sent to escort them across the Channel, and they arrived at Greenwich on the 5th of April, 1795. Caroline, on her arrival at Greenwich, was received by various dignitaries who had been sent down from London to greet her. Among them was Lady Jersey, who had been appointed as one of the new Princess of Wales's ladies-in-waiting, and whose presence in the welcoming party was, in retrospect, one of the most extraordinary and cruel arrangements that the Prince of Wales had made in connection with his marriage. Lady Jersey, the existing mistress of the Prince of Wales, was therefore one of the first faces that Caroline of Brunswick saw when she arrived in England as the future Princess of Wales. The implications of this appointment were perfectly understood by everyone involved, except, possibly, by Caroline herself, who in the early hours of her arrival was, by Lord Malmesbury's account, simply tired and overwhelmed and pleased to be received with civility. The journey from Greenwich to St. James's Palace, where the formal first meeting between Caroline and her future husband was to take place, took several hours. Caroline was given the opportunity to wash and to change her clothes and to compose herself. Lord Malmesbury, who had become, over the months of their acquaintance, an unofficial guide and supporter, was anxious about the meeting that was about to take place, and he took some pains to coach his charge on what to expect and how to behave. She was, he later reported, in good spirits, and was looking forward to meeting the prince. She had, by all accounts, allowed herself to develop, in the course of the long journey, certain hopes about the kind of marriage she was about to enter into. She had been told that her future husband was a charming and accomplished man. She had been told by various people who had reasons of their own for telling her so that he was anxious to make her happy. She had, in the way of any 27-year-old woman approaching a long-anticipated marriage, formed certain expectations. The first meeting between Caroline of Brunswick and the Prince of Wales took place in a private room at St. James's Palace on the afternoon of the 5th of April, 1795. The accounts that survive of this meeting are, by the unanimous testimony of every person present and of the two principals themselves, among the most spectacularly disastrous first meetings in the history of European royal marriage. Caroline, on being presented to the prince, attempted, by the formal etiquette of the period, to kneel before him. The prince raised her up, kissed her in the formal manner, and then almost immediately turned to one of his attendants and said, in a voice that was clearly audible to Caroline and to everyone else present, that he was feeling unwell and required a glass of brandy. He left the room. He did not return for some considerable time. Caroline, left alone in the room with Lord Malmesbury and one or two others, asked in French whether the prince was always like that. She was, by the various accounts, in a state of considerable shock. She had not expected this. Nobody had warned her that this might happen. When the prince returned, after his glass of brandy, and after some considerable composure of his own emotions, he was civil, but cold. He addressed his bride in the formal language of court etiquette. He did not, by any account, show any sign of personal warmth or any sign of pleasure in her appearance. He completed the formal introductions. He arranged for her to be conducted to the apartments that had been prepared for her in the palace. He withdrew. The two of them did not see each other again until the wedding day, which was scheduled for 3 days later. What had happened in those few minutes was that the Prince of Wales had taken an instant and visceral physical dislike to the woman he was about to marry. He had not, until that moment, seen her in the flesh. He had been told various things about her appearance, some of them more flattering than others. He had not known what to expect. What he found in the room at St. James's Palace was a woman whose physical presence was, for whatever combination of personal taste and accumulated prejudice and current emotional state, simply unacceptable to him. The Prince of Wales was, by the standards of the period, a man of considerable physical fastidiousness. He was, when he encountered something or someone that physically displeased him, capable of reactions that were, even by the relaxed standards of late Georgian male behaviour, unusually intense. His reaction to Caroline of Brunswick on first meeting her was one of those reactions, and it was, in its violence and its completeness, one of the most consequential moments of his entire life. The wedding 3 days later was conducted in conditions of considerable public splendour and considerable private misery. The ceremony took place at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace on the evening of the 8th of April 1795. The bride wore a wedding dress of considerable elaboration, which had been made for her, in the months of preparation, by some of the most fashionable London couturiers. The prince, by the accounts of the various people present at the ceremony, was visibly drunk. He had been drinking, throughout the day, in the company of various of his male friends, with the express purpose of getting through the ceremony without suffering the kind of physical reaction that he had suffered at his first meeting with the bride. He had been drinking, by all accounts, on a scale that several of his attendants had found genuinely concerning. He swayed during the ceremony. He almost fell at one point. He spoke his responses in a voice that was thick with alcohol and resentment. He did not, by any account, look at his bride throughout the ceremony. The wedding banquet that followed was conducted in conditions of slightly more managed dignity, although the prince continued to drink throughout it. Caroline, in her wedding dress, sat at the centre of the gathering and tried by the various accounts to maintain a cheerful demeanour. She was reported to have made jokes throughout the evening of the kind that she had been warned by Lord Malmesbury not to make. She was reported to have laughed too loudly at her own jokes. She was reported, in one particular incident that became part of the gossip of the court for years afterward, to have made a joke about Lady Jersey, who was present in her capacity as a lady-in-waiting, that was so direct and so cruel that several of the people present had to suppress their reactions in order to maintain decorum. The joke was reported, in due course, to Lady Jersey, who took note of it, and who would, in the months that followed, find various ways to repay the indignity. The wedding night, which was the next event in the sequence, was the subject of various confessional accounts by the prince himself in later years. According to his own subsequent description, given many years later in the context of his attempts to obtain a divorce, he was so drunk by the time he and his bride retired to the bedroom that he was incapable of performing any of the marital duties that were expected of him. He fell, by his own account, into a kind of stupor on the bedroom floor, where he remained for the duration of the night, while his bride waited, alone, in the bridal bed. He woke the next morning with no memory of the night that had passed, and with the gradual return of consciousness, the gradual realization that he was now irrevocably a married man. Whether the marriage was consummated at all in any meaningful sense in the days that followed the wedding is a question that has been the subject of considerable historical discussion. The prince's later accounts suggest that there were, in the days immediately after the wedding, 3 occasions of actual intercourse between him and his bride, conducted with what he later described as the maximum brevity and the minimum personal contact that the situation required. Whether these accounts are accurate, or whether they were invented or exaggerated for the various legal proceedings in which the prince was later engaged, cannot now be determined with certainty. What can be said with certainty is that the marriage, in any meaningful emotional sense, was a complete failure from the first moment, and that neither party, in the days and weeks that followed the wedding, made any serious attempt to make it work. The household that had been established for the new Princess of Wales was, in the design of it, a further confirmation of how things were going to go. Lady Jersey had been appointed as the senior lady-in-waiting, with control over the princess's daily routine and access to the princess's correspondence. The prince had also installed in various other positions in the household a series of men and women who were, in their personal loyalties, his own people rather than the princess's. Caroline, in the weeks after her wedding, found herself surrounded by people whose primary obligation was not to her, but to her husband and to her husband's mistress. She found, almost immediately, that her letters were being read. She found that her conversations were being reported. She found that the small attempts she made to establish her own friendships and her own preferences within the household were being systematically undermined by people who took their instructions from elsewhere. Despite all of this, by some kind of biological happenstance, Caroline became pregnant within the first weeks of the marriage. The pregnancy was confirmed by July of 1795. The birth was due, by the standard calculations, in early January of 1796. The Prince of Wales, on receiving the news of the pregnancy, was reported by various of his intimates to have responded with a kind of grim satisfaction, as if a difficult task had now, in the most basic sense, been completed. He continued, throughout the period of his wife's pregnancy, to conduct his life with Lady Jersey, and to make no serious effort to spend time with the woman he had married. Caroline, in the months of her pregnancy, conducted herself with what was, by any reasonable account, a great deal more dignity than her situation might have led one to expect. She continued in public to maintain the appearance of a contented royal wife. She made the various appearances that her position required. She wrote to her family in Brunswick letters that gave very little away about the actual conditions of her marriage. She prepared, with what assistance she could obtain, for the birth of her child. She was in this period accompanied less by Lady Jersey, who had begun to absent herself from the more domestic duties of the household, and more by various other ladies in waiting who treated her with greater kindness, and she found, in the months of her pregnancy, certain small consolations in friendships with women who were not in the active pay of her husband. And the child was born on the 7th of January, 1796. It was a daughter. She was named Charlotte Augusta, after her grandmother Queen Charlotte and her mother's mother Princess Augusta. She was, from the moment of her birth, the heir to the throne after her father, and she was, in the cold dynastic calculations of the period, the entire purpose for which the marriage of her parents had been undertaken. The Prince of Wales, on being informed of the birth of his daughter, expressed, by the various accounts, a certain mild satisfaction. He had hoped for a son, but he was, even with a daughter, in a position to have technically discharged his dynastic duty. The marriage had produced a child. The child was healthy. The succession was, in the broadest sense, secured. The Prince of Wales, with what was either staggering callousness or staggering obtuseness, acted from this point onward as if his obligations to his wife had been entirely fulfilled. Within weeks of the birth of his daughter, he began to take steps to formally separate himself from his wife. He produced a will, in late January of 1796, in which he left all his property to Mrs. Fitzherbert, and described Caroline as his wife in name only, and as the mother of his child, but otherwise as a person of no significance to him. He communicated, by way of formal letters with his wife, expressing his desire that they should henceforth lead separate lives. He proposed in these letters that she should establish her own household in a residence of her own choosing, and that he should establish his own in a residence of his own choosing, and that they should encounter each other only on the occasions when their daughter's needs or the requirements of public ceremony made it necessary. Caroline, on receiving these letters, responded with considerable dignity. She agreed in writing to the separation that her husband proposed. She accepted the conditions that he set. She moved in the spring of 1796 to a residence at Charlton, near Greenwich, that had been established for her with public funds, and she set about, with what resources she had, the difficult task of establishing some kind of independent existence as the formally separated wife of the heir to the throne. This is the situation that Caroline of Brunswick was in by the spring of 1796. She was 27 years old. She had been in England for 1 year. She was married, in name, to the heir to the British throne, whom she had not lived with for several months, and whom she would not, in any practical sense, ever live with again. She was the mother of a small daughter, whom she had given birth to in conditions of considerable distress, and whom her husband had taken steps, almost immediately, to separate from her care. She had been deprived of any meaningful authority within the royal household. She had been surrounded, in her early months in England, by people whose primary loyalty was to her husband or to her husband's mistress. She was, in any practical sense, alone, in a country whose language she spoke with difficulty, whose customs she had never fully grasped, and whose royal court had, with rare exceptions, treated her either with hostility or with indifference. She was also, however, a young woman of considerable resilience, considerable energy, and considerable inner resource. She had been trained by the chaos of her German childhood to make her own way in difficult circumstances. She had been taught by her unhappy mother that the English royal family was, in many respects, more difficult than its formal grandeur suggested. She was, despite the various humiliations she had undergone since her arrival in England, not in any way broken by them. She set about, in the years that followed her separation from the Prince of Wales, to construct for herself the kind of life that her position would allow. The residence she occupied, from the late 1790s onward, was Montague House at Blackheath, on the southern outskirts of London. It was not a grand establishment. It was a comfortable middle-sized country house with adequate grounds and adequate facilities for the kind of household she could afford to maintain. She lived there, with a small group of attendants and staff, in a kind of suburban semi-retirement that was, by the standards of the period, slightly odd for the wife of the heir to the throne. The Prince of Wales, who continued to live in considerable splendour at Carlton House and at Brighton, made no provision for his wife to maintain a more elevated style of life. She had to make do with what she had. What she did with what she had became over the course of the next decade, the source of a great deal of London gossip, and eventually of one of the most consequential investigations of late Georgian British history. The household at Blackheath was, by every account that survives of it, an unconventional one. Caroline had a particular fondness for children, which had been one of the marked features of her personality since her own childhood, and she gathered around her, at Blackheath, a small group of children of various ages and various backgrounds, whom she effectively adopted into her household. Some of them were the children of her own employees and dependents. The number of these children, at any given time, was variable. Some of them stayed in her household for years. Some of them came and went. The total number, over the years that she was at Blackheath, ran to perhaps a dozen or more. Among these children, the most important, and the one whose presence in her household became the subject of the greatest controversy, was a small boy named William Austin. William Austin had been born in 1802, the son of a London dock worker and his wife, who had brought the infant to Caroline at Blackheath in the summer of 1802 because they could not afford to support him. Caroline had taken the child into her household. She had paid from her own resources for his upbringing. She had treated him in the way that she treated several of her other adopted children, with the kind of demonstrative affection that came naturally to her. She had not, however, by any honest account, treated him with any greater favour than she treated several of the other children in her household. The presence of William Austin in the Blackheath household, however, became, by some series of misunderstandings and malicious gossip, the basis of a far more serious accusation. By 1805 or 1806, rumours had begun to circulate in certain London social circles that William Austen was not, in fact, the son of his ostensible parents at all. He was, according to these rumours, the actual son of the Princess of Wales, whom she had borne in secret in 1802, and had then concealed in her household by means of a false adoption. The implication of this rumour, given that the princess had been formally separated from her husband for several years by the date of the alleged birth, was that she had committed adultery and had borne a child by some other man, and had concealed the existence of the child by passing it off as an orphan she had taken in. The rumours in their original form came from various sources within the household at Blackheath itself. Some of the servants who had been dismissed from the household for one reason or another were inclined to spread stories about their former employer. Some of the women who had been ladies in waiting and who had fallen out with the princess were similarly inclined. And behind all of this, the Prince of Wales and his various agents were, by the early years of the new century, actively seeking material that could be used against his wife in the event that he might, at some future date, wish to seek a formal divorce. The rumours about William Austen came to the prince's attention in 1805. He took them seriously. He arranged in the autumn of 1805 for various of his agents to investigate the matter discreetly, with a view to determining whether there was any substance to the allegations. The result of these private investigations was, in due course, brought to the attention of the king and the senior ministers of the government. By the spring of 1806, it had been decided that the matter could not be left in the realm of private gossip. A formal investigation would have to be conducted by a commission of senior officials to determine, on the basis of the evidence that could be assembled, whether the Princess of Wales had in fact committed adultery and borne an illegitimate child. Now, this investigation, which has come down in history under the slightly euphemistic name of the Delicate Investigation, was conducted in the spring and summer of 1806 by a commission of 4 senior ministers of the government. The chairman was Lord Erskine, the Lord Chancellor. The other commissioners were Lord Grenville, Lord Spencer, and Lord Ellenborough. They were, by the standards of the period, men of considerable seriousness and considerable legal experience. They were not, by any account, hostile to Caroline at the outset of their investigation, but they were, in their own self-conception, public officials charged with a serious task, and they undertook it with the kind of careful procedural thoroughness that the situation seemed to require. The investigation took the form of a series of interviews conducted in private with various witnesses who claimed to have direct knowledge of the situation at Blackheath. The witnesses included some of the dismissed servants of the household, some of the former ladies in waiting, some of the medical men who had attended Caroline in various capacities, and various other people whose connection to the case was sometimes considerable and sometimes tenuous. The princess herself was not interviewed at the outset. She was, however, given the opportunity to respond in writing to the allegations that had been made against her, and her written response, when it came, was a long and impassioned document that combined indignation, denial, and an account of the circumstances of William Austen's adoption that was, in its broad outlines, perfectly consistent with the truth as it later emerged. The Commission's investigation continued for several months. The witnesses gave their various accounts. Some of them were credible. Some of them contradicted each other. The Commission, by the end of the summer of 1806, had assembled a considerable quantity of testimony, much of it of doubtful reliability, and was in a position to produce its report. The report, when it was produced in the autumn of 1806, was a document that was, by the standards of any reasonable investigation, almost completely useless. The commissioners reported that they had not found any evidence sufficient to support a charge of adultery against the Princess of Wales. They had not, in their view, established that William Austen was her son. They had in fact found considerable evidence that he was the son of his ostensible parents and had been adopted by the princess in the way that she had described, but the commissioners had also, in the course of their investigation, accumulated a great deal of testimony about the princess's general conduct at Blackheath, much of which they found, by the standards of their period, alarming. They reported that the princess had been, in their judgment, indiscreet. They reported that she had behaved on various occasions in ways that were not consistent with the dignity of her position. They reported that she had associated with men whose presence in her household was, in their view, inappropriate. They reported that her conduct, although it had not in their view amounted to actual adultery, had been such as to invite suspicion and to bring her position into question. The report, in its substance, therefore both cleared the princess of the most serious charge and condemned her of various lesser charges. It was, by any standard, an unsatisfactory document. It did not exonerate her in the way that an honest investigation might have done. It did not condemn her in the way that the Prince of Wales had hoped it would. It left her, in effect, in a kind of permanent twilight of partial accusation, in which she would, for the rest of her life, be subject to the suspicion that her behaviour, although not actually criminal, had been inappropriate enough to justify a degree of social ostracism that no formal verdict could have justified. Caroline, on receiving the report, was naturally outraged. She felt, with considerable justice, that she had been investigated on the basis of malicious gossip, and had been, despite the failure of the investigation to produce evidence against her, partially condemned by it. She wrote, in the months after the publication of the report, a series of letters to the king and to various senior ministers demanding a fuller exoneration. She made, eventually, a formal application to be received again at court. She insisted, in her various communications, that the half-condemnation contained in the commissioner's report was unjust and ought to be withdrawn. The king, who had, throughout the investigation, remained reasonably sympathetic to his niece, was inclined to accept her appeals. By the summer of 1807, after considerable political negotiation, Caroline was formally received again at court, in a public audience that was reported in the newspapers, and that was, in effect, a partial vindication of her position. She was permitted to resume the various public functions that had been suspended during the investigation. She was, in the broadest sense, returned to a position of formal acceptability, but she was not, in any deeper sense, restored to the position she had held before. The delicate investigation had, in its actual social effects, done permanent damage to her reputation. The various ladies of the court, who had been ambivalent about her in the years before 1806, were now, almost without exception, hostile. The Prince of Wales, who had hoped to use the investigation as a basis for divorce and had failed, was now even more determined to keep his wife at a distance from any position that might allow her to claim public sympathy. The newspapers, which had picked up various of the rumours and various of the reports, treated her, from this point onward, with a mixture of mockery and condescension that was difficult to deflect. She was, in the years after 1807, formally accepted at court but socially marginalised, formally not guilty but informally condemned, formally the Princess of Wales but in actual social fact a person of considerably reduced standing. The years that followed between 1807 and 1814 were, for Caroline of Brunswick, a period of slow and painful adjustment to her diminished position. She continued to live, for the most part, at Blackheath. She continued to maintain her household of adopted children. She continued to appear, on the formal occasions when her position required, at the various royal events that she could not avoid. She continued to write to her family in Brunswick, and to receive their news, and to maintain the various correspondences that linked her to her own past in Germany. She had, in this period, two principal sources of personal consolation. The first was her daughter, Princess Charlotte, who was now growing into a young girl of considerable personality and considerable promise, and who, despite the various restrictions that her father had placed on her contact with her mother, continued to be the central emotional fact of Caroline's existence. Caroline was permitted, under the terms of the various separation agreements, to see her daughter for limited periods on specific days. The visits were rigidly supervised by various of the prince's representatives. The duration of the visits was strictly limited. The places where the visits could occur were specified in advance. But within these constraints, Caroline did see her daughter, and the relationship between them, although it was conducted under conditions that would have crushed most relationships, remained alive and warm throughout the years of Princess Charlotte's adolescence. The second source of consolation in this period was a small circle of personal friends who had, despite the social complications, remained loyal to Caroline through the various difficulties of the post-investigation years. These included some of her own ladies-in-waiting who had taken her side during the investigation and had remained with her thereafter. They included some figures from London literary and political society who had been, for one reason or another, sympathetic to her position. And they included, increasingly, various political figures of the Whig opposition who had begun, by the late 1800s, to recognise that Caroline of Brunswick could be, in their long campaign against the Prince of Wales and his Tory friends, a potentially useful political ally. The political dimension of Caroline's position, which would become enormously more important in 1820, was already beginning, in the years between 1807 and 1814, to take its first shape. By 1810, however, the broader context of Caroline's position had begun to change in ways that would prove decisive. King George III, who had been her uncle and her patron, and who had remained throughout the various scandals of the previous decade, the most senior figure in the British royal family who was prepared to be openly sympathetic to her, suffered, in the autumn of 1810, the final and most serious episode of the mental illness that had been recurring intermittently since 1788. By the early months of 1811, it had become clear that the king would not recover and that some kind of formal regency would have to be established. The Regency Act, passed by Parliament in February of 1811, established the Prince of Wales as Prince Regent with full royal powers for the duration of his father's incapacity. The Prince Regent, who would in due course become King George IV, was thereby installed in the actual exercise of royal power, while his father remained alive but incapacitated at Windsor. For Caroline, this development was a serious blow. The protection that her uncle had been able to provide her, however limited and however reluctant in some respects, was now no longer available. Her husband, who had been her enemy for 15 years, was now, in effect, the actual sovereign of the country. His ability to make her life difficult, which had previously been constrained by his father's authority, was now considerably less constrained. The years between 1811 and 1814 were therefore, for Caroline, a period of progressive isolation. The Prince Regent moved, in various small ways, to restrict her contacts with their daughter. He moved to limit her appearances at court. He moved to constrain her financially. He did not, at this stage, move to seek a formal divorce. The political risks of attempting such a thing, in the midst of the wars against Napoleon and in the context of his own deeply unpopular extravagance, were considered by his advisers to be too great. But he made it clear, by every small act and every small omission, that the Princess of Wales was, in his view, a person of no significance, and that her residence in England was a fact that he tolerated only because he could not, at present, find a way to end it. By 1813 and 1814, Caroline had begun to consider the possibility of leaving England altogether. The conditions of her life had become, by these years, almost intolerable. She was, despite her formal position, isolated and underused. She was, despite her residence in one of the most cosmopolitan cities of Europe, deprived of the social engagement that her temperament required. She was, despite the constant low-grade hostility of her husband, prevented from any meaningful response to him. She had throughout these years begun to think that perhaps a residence on the continent would offer her, at the very least, the possibility of a more interesting life. The decision to leave was made finally in the spring of 1814. The political conditions had shifted. Napoleon had been defeated for the first time. The continental Europe that had been closed to British travellers for nearly 20 years was now, briefly, open again. The various royal courts that had been displaced by the French wars were now being re-established. There was, for someone of Caroline's connections and Caroline's restlessness, an opportunity to undertake the kind of European tour that her position would normally have permitted, but that the wars had made impossible. Caroline applied in the spring of 1814 for permission to leave the country. The Prince Regent, on receiving the application, expressed himself as supportive of the proposal, with what was almost certainly, in retrospect, considerable private satisfaction. The departure of his estranged wife from England would, from his perspective, considerably simplify the management of his domestic situation. He gave his consent with considerable speed. Princess Charlotte, who was by now 18 and was approaching her own marriage, was deeply distressed by her mother's plans. The relationship between them had been, throughout Charlotte's adolescence, the most important emotional fact of both their lives, despite the various restrictions that had been imposed on it. Charlotte begged her mother to reconsider. Caroline, in the conversations that took place between them in the summer of 1814, was sympathetic but resolute. She told her daughter, in various of these conversations, that she could no longer endure the life she had been leading in England. She told her that she would write often, that she would return when she could, that the separation would not be permanent. She prepared, with what she had, for her departure. The departure itself took place in August of 1814. Caroline embarked, at Worthing on the south coast, on a British naval frigate that had been provided for her use. She took with her a small household of ladies in waiting and male attendants. She took with her a substantial quantity of luggage. She took with her the small William Austin, now 12 years old, whom she had refused to leave behind in England. The frigate sailed on the 9th of August 1814 for the continent. Caroline, on the deck of the ship as the English coast disappeared behind her, was reported by various of her attendants to have wept briefly, and then to have composed herself, and to have set about the business of organizing the future that lay ahead of her with the kind of practical energy that had always been one of her defining characteristics. She would not, as it turned out, see her daughter again. Princess Charlotte died 3 years later in the childbirth that we have already described in some detail, and Caroline received the news of her daughter's death by letter in Italy several weeks after the event. The mother and the daughter, who had loved each other through all the various difficulties that had been imposed on them, were not granted the consolation of meeting one final time. Caroline, in her grief, would in subsequent years recall the parting at Worthing as one of the most painful moments of her entire life. She had not known at the time that it was the last time she would see her child. She had not, in her hopes for the future, anticipated the various tragedies that would unfold in the years to come. She had in the moment been departing for what she thought would be a long and interesting period of foreign travel, with the prospect of eventual return when conditions in England had improved. She would in the event never have the chance to test that prospect. The continental years between 1814 and 1820 are in many ways the most colourful and the most controversial period of Caroline's entire life. They are also the period that has been the most thoroughly investigated by historians, partly because the quantity of surviving documentary evidence about this period is enormous, and partly because the events of these years became the subject of the most exhaustive legal proceeding of the entire scandal, which was the parliamentary trial that followed her return to England in 1820. The pattern of her travels, in the months and years after her departure from England, was that of a wealthy and somewhat eccentric British tourist of the post-Napoleonic period. She crossed from England to Brunswick, where she spent some weeks with her surviving family. She travelled from Brunswick south through the various small German states, with stops in various of the small courts where she had family connections. She crossed the Alps in the autumn of 1814 into Italy. She spent the winter of 1814 to 1815 at Naples in a residence that she had taken on a long lease. It was at Naples in the autumn of 1814 that the most consequential single decision of her continental period was made. She had, on her arrival in Italy, found that her household needed reinforcement. She had brought from England a small staff, but the various practical demands of running a substantial establishment in a foreign country required additional personnel, and she set about, in her usual practical way, the task of recruiting. Among the various people she hired in this period was a young Italian man who had been recommended to her by a member of her existing staff. His name was Bartolomeo Pergami. He was, at the time of his employment, 27 years old, the son of a small Italian landowner from the region around Cremona, in Lombardy. He had served in various capacities in various of the Italian armies that had been involved in the recent Napoleonic Wars. He had been, in his most recent position, in the service of an Italian general who had recommended him to Caroline as a man of considerable physical capability and considerable practical competence, who would be useful in the various organizational tasks that her household required. Pergami was hired initially in the position of courier, which in the conventions of the period meant a kind of all-purpose male attendant who would manage the practical arrangements of foreign travel, who would handle the various dealings with innkeepers and posting masters and luggage handlers and customs officials, and who would, in the broader sense, take responsibility for the orderly conduct of the various journeys that the household was required to undertake. It was a position of considerable trust, but of moderate social standing. Pergami began his duties in November of 1814 in Naples, and he would remain, in one capacity or another, in Caroline's service for the next 7 years, until her death in 1821. The relationship between Caroline of Brunswick and Bartolomeo Pergami, which began as a straightforward employer-employee arrangement in November of 1814, developed, over the months and years that followed, into something considerably more complicated. The exact nature of the relationship has been the subject of intense historical and legal investigation. The defenders of Caroline have argued, throughout the years that followed, that the relationship was always entirely proper and was conducted within the conventional bounds of the relationship between a royal lady and her chamberlain. The detractors of Caroline have argued, with what was, by the standards of the eventual trial, a great deal of testimony from witnesses who had been in a position to observe the household closely, that the relationship was, in essence, that of a woman and her lover, conducted under the thin disguise of a master and servant arrangement. Accent, the lovene bestrumten. The truth, as far as it can now be established, is almost certainly closer to the second view than to the first. Caroline and Pergami, by the various accounts that have survived, became, by the end of 1815, a couple in the practical sense of the word. They lived in the same houses. They travelled together, often without other attendants present. They were observed on numerous occasions, in postures and circumstances that were, by the standards of the period, not consistent with the formal employer-employee relationship. They referred to each other, in private settings, in terms of considerable affection. The various servants of the household, who were eventually called as witnesses in the parliamentary trial, were nearly unanimous in their description of a relationship that had, over the course of the continental years, become something that could only be described as romantic. I want to be careful in describing this aspect of Caroline's life, to maintain the kind of restraint that the period itself would have observed. The actual sexual relationship between Caroline and Pergami, if it existed, was conducted in private. and the various reports of it are inferences drawn from circumstantial evidence rather than direct observations. The witnesses who eventually testified to the trial in 1820 were, in many cases, of doubtful reliability, and several of them were openly in the pay of the Prince Regent's agents. The historical evidence, taken as a whole, is sufficient to make clear that the relationship was, in some meaningful sense, more than a formal employment arrangement, but the precise details have to be left, as they would have been left in the period itself, to the imagination. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that Caroline of Brunswick, in the years after her departure from England, found in Bartolomeo Pergami a kind of companionship that her marriage had never provided her. She had been, throughout the previous 20 years, in a position of profound emotional isolation. She had had a husband who hated her. She had had a court that had, for the most part, treated her with hostility. She had had, with the brief exception of her separation period at Blackheath, no opportunity for the kind of warm, everyday companionship that any human being requires for happiness. In Pergami, she found a man who treated her with kindness, who listened to her, who was capable of running her household with considerable competence, and who was, in his own person, by all accounts, a man of considerable warmth and considerable physical attractiveness. The relationship, whatever its precise sexual nature, was clearly the most personally satisfying relationship of her adult life. Over the years that followed, Pergami's status within the household rose. He was promoted in 1815 from courier to chamberlain, which was a more elevated position carrying more general responsibility. He was given, in 1816, an estate in southern Italy, the Villa Vittoria at Pesaro on the Adriatic coast, which became Caroline's principal residence for several years. He was joined in the household by various members of his own family, including his mother, his daughter from a previous marriage, and various of his brothers and sisters. The household became, in effect, a kind of extended Pergami family establishment, presided over by a foreign princess in a small Italian coastal town, in conditions of considerable comfort and considerable eccentricity. Caroline travelled in these years on a scale that was unusual even for wealthy British travellers of the period. She visited Rome, Florence, Venice, Milan, and most of the other principal Italian cities. She crossed in the spring of 1816 into the eastern Mediterranean. She visited Greece. She visited Constantinople. She visited the Holy Land, where she conducted in Jerusalem what was reported to be a serious and devout tour of the Christian holy places. She visited Tunis. She visited Sicily. She undertook, in the years between 1815 and 1818, a program of travel that would have been impressive for any British tourist of the period, and that was for a 50-year-old woman of royal birth travelling without any official protection. Genuinely remarkable. Throughout these travels, Pergami was at her side. He managed the practical arrangements. He acted as her chamberlain on formal occasions. He was, in the various accounts of foreign visitors who encountered the party at one place or another, treated by Caroline with a degree of public deference that was unusual and that several observers found unconventional. He sat at her table at meals. He travelled in her carriage. He was at various of the formal receptions that she gave or attended, accorded a position of public prominence that no employer-employee relationship of the period would normally have justified. The reports of these arrangements began, almost immediately, to make their way back to London. Various British travellers who encountered Caroline at one Italian city or another wrote home in private letters that were sometimes published in the newspapers, with reports of the unusual conduct of the Princess of Wales abroad. British diplomats stationed in the various Italian states began to send, through their official channels, reports of the same kind. By 1816 and 1817, the rumours about Caroline's continental conduct had become, in London, a matter of routine gossip among the politically informed classes. By 1818, the rumours had become sufficiently substantial that the Prince Regent's government had begun to consider, seriously, whether the various reports might be assembled into the basis for a formal legal action against her. The decision to assemble formal evidence against Caroline, taken in London in 1818, was made by the Prince Regent in consultation with his closest political advisers. The mechanism by which the evidence was to be collected was a body that came to be known, in the historical literature, as the Milan Commission. It was in essence a private investigative tribunal set up at British expense in the Italian city of Milan, where various of the principal informants about Caroline's conduct were resident and tasked with collecting, organising, and verifying the testimony of witnesses who claimed direct knowledge of the alleged adultery between Caroline and Pergami. The Milan Commission operated between 1818 and 1820 in a kind of legal grey zone that was, even by the standards of the period, of doubtful propriety. It was a British government body paid for from public funds, conducting investigations in a foreign country into the conduct of a member of the British royal family, with the express purpose of assembling evidence for a future legal proceeding that had not yet been formally authorised. The witnesses who appeared before the commission were paid for their testimony by means of various financial arrangements that were intended to be discreet, but that were in practice perfectly visible to anyone who chose to look. The various witnesses had, in many cases, been former servants of Caroline's household who had been dismissed or who had left under circumstances that gave them grievances against her. They were not, by any reasonable standard, disinterested witnesses. Their testimony, although it was assembled with considerable apparent thoroughness, was the testimony of people who had been paid by the Prince Regent's agents to say what wanted to hear. The Commission, over the 18 months of its operation, assembled a substantial dossier of testimony. It included statements from former housemaids, footmen, valets, kitchen staff, and various other employees of Caroline's establishments at Naples, Genoa, and Pesaro. The testimony described, in considerable circumstantial detail, the various indications of an intimate relationship between Caroline and Pergami that the witnesses claimed to have observed. There was testimony about shared bedrooms. There was testimony about embraces observed in private rooms. There was testimony about the conduct of meals and journeys. There was a great deal of detail, much of it of the kind that would, when produced in open court, prove damaging to Caroline's reputation regardless of whether it was strictly accurate or not. By the autumn of 1819, the Milan Commission had produced its report, which was forwarded to London. The report was, in the view of the Prince Regent's advisers, sufficient to support a formal legal action against Caroline on the charge of adultery. The political circumstances, however, were not yet quite right for action. The country was, in the autumn of 1819, in a state of considerable political tension following the events at Peterloo, where a peaceful political demonstration had been violently dispersed by yeomanry cavalry with several deaths. The political mood was hostile to the government in general and to the Prince Regent in particular, and the Prince Regent's advisers, including in particular Lord Liverpool, the Prime Minister, and Lord Castlereagh, the Foreign Secretary, urged him to delay any action against his wife until the political situation had stabilised. The political situation, as it happened, did not stabilise so much as transform. On the 29th of January 1820, King George III died at Windsor. He had been, for the previous decade, almost entirely incapacitated by his mental illness, but his actual death produced a series of immediate political consequences. The Prince Regent became, on the moment of his father's death, King George IV. Caroline of Brunswick, who had been throughout the long period of the regency the wife of the Prince Regent, became, on the same moment, the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. The implications of this change of status were, for both parties to the marriage, immediately serious. The new king had, throughout the years of the Regency, been able to keep his wife at a kind of arm's length, allowing her continental travels and ignoring her existence as far as possible. He could not, as king, continue this arrangement indefinitely. The Queen Consort had, by the established conventions of the British monarchy, certain rights and certain ceremonial functions that could not be permanently denied her. She had in particular the right to be prayed for by name in the prayers of the Church of England, alongside her husband. She had the right to attend the coronation of her husband, which was scheduled for some date in the near future. She had, in the broadest sense, the right to a public position alongside her husband that no amount of private hostility could permanently exclude her from. The new king, in the days immediately after his father's death, was therefore confronted with a choice. He could either reach some kind of accommodation with his wife, by which she would be permitted certain ceremonial functions in exchange for not making public claims to the others, or he could move, finally, to seek a formal divorce, on the basis of the evidence that the Milan Commission had assembled with the intention of removing her from the position of Queen Consort and from the various rights that the position carried with it. He chose, after some weeks of internal deliberation, the second option. The political risks of attempting a divorce, which had been judged too great in 1819, were now considered, in the early weeks of 1820, to be acceptable. The new king was determined that his wife should not be queen. He believed, with what was almost certainly self-deceiving intensity, that the country would support him in his determination. He instructed his ministers, in February of 1820, to begin preparing the formal legal proceedings that would lead to the divorce. The mechanism that was eventually settled on was unusual and reflected the constitutional difficulties of attempting to divorce a queen consort. There was no court in England that had the formal jurisdiction to dissolve the marriage of the sovereign. The ecclesiastical courts, which dealt with most matrimonial matters, did not have such jurisdiction in the case of the king. The civil courts, similarly, had no jurisdiction. The only body that could, in any meaningful sense, dissolve the marriage was Parliament itself, by the device of a Bill of Pains and Penalties, which was a kind of extraordinary legislation that allowed Parliament to impose specific penalties on a named individual for specific conduct, in the manner of a legislative trial. The Bill of Pains and Penalties that was eventually drafted in the spring of 1820 named Caroline of Brunswick by name. It accused her of adultery with Bartolomeo Pergami. It proposed as the penalties for the alleged adultery the deprivation of her title as queen, the deprivation of all her rights and privileges as the wife of the sovereign, and the dissolution of her marriage. It was, by any standard, an extraordinary measure. It would require, to become law, the consent of both Houses of Parliament. It would, in its passage through the House of Lords, take the form of a kind of full legal trial, with evidence being heard, witnesses being examined, and counsel arguing on both sides. It was, in its conception, the most spectacular and the most exposing legal proceeding that any member of the British royal family had ever been subjected to. The decision to proceed with the bill was taken by the king and his advisers in the spring of 1820. The various preparatory arrangements were put in hand. The witnesses who had been assembled by the Milan Commission were notified that they would be required to testify in London. The travel arrangements for them were made. The legal teams were assembled. The Lord Chancellor was briefed. The political ground was, as far as possible, prepared. But there was one element of the situation that the king and his advisers had, by their concentration on the legal mechanics, somewhat underestimated. Caroline of Brunswick, in Italy, was not unaware of what was being prepared for her. Her own informants in London had been keeping her informed. She had been receiving, throughout the spring of 1820, regular reports of the various steps that were being taken to prepare a formal action against her. She had, during these months, been giving careful consideration to her own response. She had been consulting with various legal advisers, both Italian and British. She had been thinking, with considerable seriousness about what her best course of action was. Her decision by the late spring of 1820 was that she would return to England. She would not, as her enemies had hoped, remain on the continent and accept whatever terms were eventually offered to her. She would not, as some of her own friends had advised, negotiate from a distance for some kind of settlement that would allow her to retain a portion of her position while remaining abroad. She would return to England in person and confront the proceedings that had been initiated against her in the place where they were being conducted, with her own physical presence as the central political fact of the situation. This decision, which was communicated to her advisers in May of 1820, was the most consequential decision of her entire life. It was also, in many ways, the bravest. She was, at the time of the decision, 52 years old. She had been out of England for 6 years. She had no organised political base in the country. She had no financial resources that the British government could not, at any moment, cut off. She had no protection of any kind beyond what her own personality and the loyalty of her remaining friends could provide her. She was, in every practical sense, walking into the most hostile political environment that any member of the British royal family had encountered in living memory. But she was also walking into a country where the political and social conditions had begun, by the spring of 1820, to be considerably more favourable to her than the king and his advisers had recognised. The years between 1815 and 1820 had been, in Britain, a period of severe economic distress and considerable political ferment. The various wars had ended. The economy had not adjusted well to the peace. There had been, in various parts of the country, riots, demonstrations and movements for political reform. The Peterloo Massacre, in August of 1819, had outraged a substantial portion of the country. The various draconian measures that the government had passed in response, the so-called 6 Acts, had outraged a considerably larger portion. The king himself, with his enormous personal extravagance, his estranged wife, his various mistresses, his architectural follies, and his unpopular Tory ministers, was, by the spring of 1820, the most disliked British sovereign of modern times. In this context, Caroline of Brunswick, despite all her own eccentricities, and despite all the various respects in which her conduct had been, by any honest reckoning, less than entirely creditable, was a figure who had, in the popular imagination, become a kind of symbol of resistance to the king and to everything he represented. The various reports of her continental travels, which had been intended by the king's agents to undermine her reputation, had, in their actual effects on public opinion, served only to emphasize that here was a woman who had been mistreated by her husband, who had been excluded from her own daughter, who had been investigated by secret commissions, and who was now being subjected to formal legal proceedings of the most intrusive kind. The popular sympathy for her, which had been latent in 1814, had become, by the spring of 1820, something close to active and organised political support. The various Whig politicians who had cultivated her over the years now found themselves in a position to give her substantial public backing. The various radical movements which had been agitating for political reform throughout the previous decade now found, in the cause of the persecuted Queen, a popular issue that they could use to mobilize considerable public support. Caroline travelled, in the late spring of 1820, from Italy to the French Channel coast, on a journey that was reported in considerable detail by the various newspaper correspondents who had been sent to follow her. Her progress through France, although she had no official status and no diplomatic protection, was the subject of considerable popular attention even in the foreign country. The local populations turned out, in various towns along the route, to see the British Queen passing through. She was treated by the various French authorities with a courteous indifference that was, in the diplomatic conditions of the period, the best she could have hoped for. She arrived at the French port of Calais on the 5th of June 1820. She embarked the next day on a packet boat that had been engaged for her use. She crossed the Channel in conditions of moderate weather, and she landed at Dover on the afternoon of the 6th of June 1820, after an absence of nearly 6 years from English soil. The reception that awaited her at Dover was, by every account that survives of it, one of the most extraordinary public demonstrations that the country had seen in years. The town of Dover had been, for several days before her expected arrival, filling up with people who had travelled from London and from various other parts of the country, specifically in order to be present at her landing. The cliffs above the harbour were, by the afternoon of the 6th of June, lined with crowds. The streets of the town were packed. The various inns and lodging houses were full. There were estimates, in the contemporary newspaper reports, of crowds running into the tens of thousands. When Caroline's packet boat appeared in the harbour, the crowds erupted into the kind of cheering that the contemporary observers reported as having been beyond their previous experience of public demonstration. The cheering continued with brief intermissions throughout the long process of her disembarkation. She was greeted at the harbour side by a small group of her supporters who had come down from London to receive her. She was helped, with considerable difficulty given the press of the crowd, into the carriage that had been provided for her. The carriage proceeded slowly through the streets of Dover, with the crowds reaching for it, throwing flowers, calling out her name, and conducting themselves with the kind of mass enthusiasm that would, in modern terms, be described as somewhere between a coronation and a popular uprising. Caroline herself, throughout this reception, was by all accounts deeply moved. She had not anticipated, in her preparations for the return, the scale of the popular reception that had been waiting for her. She wept several times in the carriage at the various scenes she observed. She stood repeatedly to acknowledge the cheers of the crowd. She spoke in the snatches of conversation that were possible in the conditions of her gratitude and her pleasure at being finally back in the country that had been her home for the previous 25 years. The journey from Dover to London took 2 days. The same scenes, on a slightly smaller scale, were repeated at every town along the route. Canterbury was full of crowds. Sittingbourne was full of crowds. Rochester was full of crowds. The various villages in between were lined with people who had come out from their houses and their fields to wave at the carriage as it passed. Caroline, in the 2nd day of the journey, was reported to be exhausted by the constant emotional intensity of the reception, but she continued throughout to acknowledge the crowds with the kind of warmth that her temperament had always made natural to her. This Tuesday, I can smolder. She entered London on the 7th of June, 1820, in conditions of unprecedented public tumult. The streets through which her carriage passed were so densely packed with spectators that the progress of the carriage was, at various points, brought to a complete halt. The people in the streets shouted her name. They called out blessings. They sang the various popular songs that had been composed in her favour during the previous months of public agitation. They abused the king in the same breath in which they cheered his estranged wife, with a directness and a freedom that the political authorities found genuinely alarming. There were various small disturbances along the route, with the lifeguards being called out to clear particular streets, although there was no significant violence and no serious injuries. The lodging that had been arranged for Caroline in central London was the house of Alderman Matthew Wood, a Whig politician and former Lord Mayor of London, who had become, in the previous months, one of her most active and most useful supporters. The house in South Audley Street was modest by the standards of royal residence, but it was offered to Caroline freely, and was in any case the only suitable place in London that was clearly outside the political control of the King's government. She entered the house on the evening of the 7th of June with the crowd still filling the streets around it, and she settled in to begin the public phase of her return. The political reaction in the days that followed was one of considerable confusion. The king, on receiving the news of his wife's reception, was reported by his intimates to have been in a state of considerable agitation. He had not anticipated in his calculations that she would be received as a public heroine. He had assumed that her continental conduct, when its details were made known, would be sufficient to discredit her with the British public. He was now confronted with the evidence that the British public, far from being scandalized, had taken her side in advance of any formal proceeding, and was prepared to back her with a degree of enthusiasm that no royal personage of his side could plausibly match. He insisted in his communications with his ministers that the legal proceedings against her should now go forward with all possible speed. The political damage of leaving her in the country, undefeated and popular, was, in his view, considerably greater than the political damage of pursuing the proceedings to their conclusion. The ministers, in their response, were considerably more cautious. Lord Liverpool, the Prime Minister, had warned the King against the divorce proceedings throughout the previous year. He continued in June and July of 1820 to argue that the political situation was such as to make any pursuit of the matter dangerous. He was overruled. The Bill of Pains and Penalties was formally introduced into the House of Lords on the 5th of July, 1820. The procedure that would now be followed was, by any standard, extraordinary. The bill would be read for a second time on a date some weeks in the future. Between the second reading and the third, the House of Lords would conduct in effect a formal trial of the Queen, with evidence being heard, witnesses being examined and cross-examined, and counsel arguing for both sides. At the end of this proceeding, the Lords would vote on whether to pass the bill. If they did, the bill would then be sent to the House of Commons, where the same procedure would, in some form, be repeated. If the bill passed both houses, it would receive the royal assent, and Caroline would be deprived of her position. If it failed at any stage, she would remain queen. The whole proceeding, in its conception, was an enormous gamble for the king. It would expose his marriage to the most thorough public examination. It would require the testimony of dozens of witnesses in open court on the most intimate details of his wife's private life. It would, by the inevitable mechanics of cross-examination, also expose his own conduct to public scrutiny, since his wife's defense would inevitably argue, in mitigation of any conduct of hers, that her husband's own behaviour had been considerably worse, and it would throughout the months of its conduct keep the entire scandal at the centre of the public attention of the country, in a way that would either justify the king's actions in the eyes of the public, or condemn them with overwhelming force. The legal teams that were assembled on both sides were among the most formidable that any English legal proceeding had ever brought together. The case for the bill was led by the Attorney General, Sir Robert Gifford, and the Solicitor General, John Singleton Copley, supported by various senior barristers. The case for the defence was led by Henry Brougham, who was at this period the most brilliant Whig barrister in the country, and who would, in the months that followed, conduct one of the most spectacular legal defences in English history. Brougham was supported by Thomas Denman, who was Caroline's principal legal adviser, and who had, throughout the previous decade, served her in various legal capacities. He was also supported by various other barristers and solicitors who had, between them, expertise in every aspect of the unusual proceeding that was about to begin. The Bill of Pains and Penalties was given its second reading in the House of Lords on the 17th of August 1820. The trial, in the formal sense, began on that date. It would continue with various procedural pauses until the 10th of November of the same year. It would consist, throughout, of the most intense and the most observed legal proceeding that the country had ever conducted. It would, in its various dimensions, expose the British royal family to a kind of public scrutiny that would have profound consequences for the institution itself for many years to come. Let me pause for a moment before we go further into the trial itself to give you some sense of what London was actually like during these months, because the conditions in the city throughout the autumn of 1820 were unlike anything that the country had experienced before, and the political and social atmosphere of those weeks formed the backdrop against which everything that happened in the House of Lords took place. The trial was held in the chamber of the House of Lords itself, which is to say in the Old Palace of Westminster, in a building that was the central physical location of the British legislature, and that was, by the standards of the period, a place of considerable formal dignity. The entrance to the chamber, throughout the months of the trial, was constantly besieged by crowds. The peers on their daily journey to and from the chamber had to be protected by detachments of the lifeguards. The various witnesses, when they were brought to and from the chamber for their testimony, had to be smuggled through back streets to avoid the kind of popular hostility that would, on more than one occasion, threaten their physical safety. The king himself, throughout the months of the trial, was forced to remain almost entirely out of public view, retreating between Carlton House in London and the Pavilion at Brighton, because his appearance in any public space was certain to provoke demonstrations of hostility that the political authorities could not control. Caroline, by contrast, was constantly visible. She had moved, in the weeks following her arrival in London, from the modest house in South Audley Street to a more substantial residence at Brandenburg House in Hammersmith, on the western outskirts of London. From this base she travelled every day on which the trial was sitting to the House of Lords in a public procession that was, in its scale and its enthusiasm, more like a daily royal entry than the journey of an accused person to her trial. The various aristocratic supporters who had attached themselves to her cause provided her with carriages, with horses, with attendants. The crowds in the streets cheered her every appearance. The newspapers, the great majority of which had, by this date, taken her side, reported every detail of her daily journeys, her dress, her demeanour, her health. The newspapers themselves, throughout this period, were operating at a level of public engagement that was historically unusual. The country had a vigorous and competitive press by the standards of the period, but the ordinary daily circulation of the various London papers had been before the trial in the low thousands for any given title. During the months of the trial, the daily circulations of several of the principal London papers ran into the tens of thousands, and the secondary readership, by way of coffee houses and reading rooms and the simple practice of newspapers being passed from hand to hand, ran into the hundreds of thousands. The country, in a way that was new to its political experience, was reading about the trial every day in a level of detail that was unprecedented. The various witnesses, the various items of testimony, the various legal arguments, the various procedural rulings were all reported and discussed and analysed in public to an extent that had no real parallel in any previous British political proceeding. The various pamphleteers and caricaturists of the period also produced, throughout the months of the trial, an enormous quantity of supporting material that circulated, often in cheap printed form, among the wider public. The caricaturists, who included several of the greatest practitioners of the form in the entire history of the medium, produced images of the king and his ministers that were, by any standard, savagely critical. The pamphleteers produced tracts of various kinds, some of them serious legal analysis, some of them satirical, some of them frankly pornographic in their treatment of the alleged conduct of the various parties. The whole of London, in the autumn of 1820, was awash with printed material of one kind or another, all of it concerning the trial and the various people involved in it. Within this atmosphere, the actual proceeding in the House of Lords unfolded. The case for the bill, presented by the Attorney General over the course of several days at the opening of the trial, was a comprehensive recital of the various allegations that the Milan Commission had assembled. It described in considerable detail the alleged intimacies between Caroline and Pergami, the various circumstances in which the relationship had been observed, the various small details of the household arrangements that had been reported to the Commission. It was, as legal advocacy goes, a careful and thorough presentation, although it had been made considerably less effective by the fact that nearly every member of the public who had read the newspapers had, by the time the formal case opened, already encountered most of the allegations in one form or another. The witnesses for the prosecution, when they were called, were the various former servants and employees who had given testimony to the Milan Commission, and who had now been brought to England to repeat their testimony in person. The most important of these witnesses, by general agreement, was a man named Theodore Majocchi, who had been one of the household staff at Pesaro, and who claimed to have direct personal knowledge of the various intimate arrangements between Caroline and Pagami. Majocchi was an Italian who spoke very little English. His testimony was given through an interpreter. He was, in his early appearances, a relatively effective witness for the prosecution, providing the kind of specific circumstantial detail that the case required. The cross-examination of Theodore Majocchi, conducted by Henry Brougham over several long days in the autumn of 1820, became, in due course, one of the most famous legal cross-examinations in English history. Brougham, by a combination of patient questioning and skillful manipulation of the interpreter, gradually exposed the witness's testimony as a tissue of evasions and contradictions. He pressed Majocchi repeatedly on the specific details of the various incidents he had described. He asked him about times, dates, locations, the presence or absence of other witnesses, the arrangement of furniture, the colour of curtains, the precise sequence of events on particular days. Majocchi, faced with this sustained and detailed cross-examination, found himself increasingly unable to remember the specifics that his original testimony had contained. He resorted, with increasing frequency, to the Italian phrase non mi ricordo, which means, I do not remember. The phrase non mi ricordo, in the course of Majocchi's cross-examination, was used by him so many times that it became, almost immediately, a kind of national joke. The newspapers reported every instance of it. The caricaturists drew Majocchi in various postures of evasion, with non mi ricordo issuing from his mouth in elaborate banners. The pamphleteers seized on the phrase as a symbol of the unreliability of the entire prosecution case. By the end of Majocchi's evidence, the prosecution's most important witness had been so thoroughly discredited that his testimony was, in effect, useless, and the phrase non mi ricordo had passed into the common speech of London for the next several months as the standard way of mocking any kind of evasive answer. The other witnesses for the prosecution, although they were less spectacularly discredited than Majocchi, fared, on the whole, almost as badly. They were subjected to the same kind of patient and detailed cross-examination by Brougham and his colleagues. They were exposed in various ways as having been paid for their testimony, as having grievances against Caroline that gave them motives to lie, as having been coached by the Milan Commission's agents in the specific testimony they would give. By the end of the prosecution case in mid-October, the entire body of evidence that the King's government had assembled had been reduced in the public perception and in the perception of many of the peers in the chamber to a body of tainted and unreliable testimony that did not convincingly support the charges in the bill. The defence case, which opened in early October of 1820, was conducted by Henry Brougham with the kind of extended rhetorical brilliance that made his reputation for the rest of his long life. His opening speech for the defence, delivered over several days, was one of the great parliamentary performances of the 19th century. He laid out, in patient and devastating detail, the various respects in which the prosecution case was unreliable. He laid out the various respects in which the King's own conduct, throughout the marriage, had been considerably worse than anything that had been alleged against the Queen. He laid out, with a careful indirection that was the more effective for its restraint, the implications of the various counter-allegations that Caroline's defense could, if necessary, bring against her husband. He suggested, in language that was just short of explicit threat, that the prosecution might wish to consider whether its persistence in the present proceeding would not, in due course, expose certain matters that would not be helpful to the Crown. The most famous passage of Brougham's defence, which has been quoted in various forms ever since, was his warning about the consequences of attempting to reduce the Queen on the basis of evidence that the defence could refute. He suggested, in his characteristic oblique style, that those who reach for the lightning bolt may find that it strikes them rather than their target. The implication, which everyone in the chamber understood, was that if the bill failed, or even if it succeeded by too narrow a margin, the political damage to the king would be considerable, and the political momentum that the trial had generated against the king's whole regime would be, in its consequences, beyond anything that the bill itself could compensate for. The defence witnesses, when they were called, were a varied group. They included various of Caroline's loyal English servants who testified to her general conduct over the years. They included various of her continental friends and acquaintances who testified to the propriety of her household arrangements. They included Bartolomeo Pergami's daughter Vittorina, a young woman who had grown up partly in Caroline's household and who testified, with considerable composure, to the relationship between Caroline and her father as it had appeared from her own perspective. None of the defence witnesses, it should be said, were any more obviously disinterested than the prosecution witnesses had been. They had in many cases their own loyalties and their own interests in the outcome of the case. But they presented, taken as a whole, a reasonably coherent picture of the household at Pesaro that did not require the listener to accept the most extreme allegations of the prosecution. The closing arguments, which were heard in the first week of November, were of considerable rhetorical splendour on both sides. The Attorney General, summing up for the prosecution, defended the credibility of the witnesses and the validity of the case. Brougham, summing up for the defence, denounced the entire proceeding as a politically motivated persecution of an innocent woman and an unjust attempt to deprive her of her rightful position. The peers who had sat through every day of the proceedings and who had heard by this stage hundreds of hours of testimony and argument were left to vote on the bill on the basis of their own judgments of what they had heard. The vote on the third reading of the bill, taken on the 10th of November 1820, was the most consequential moment of the entire trial. The peers were called to vote, in the conventional manner of the House of Lords, by passing through one of two lobbies according to whether they supported or opposed the bill. The count, when it was completed, showed the bill passing by a majority of 9 votes. The exact figures were 108 peers in favour, 99 against. By any reasonable standard, this was an extremely narrow majority for a piece of legislation of this importance. It was, in particular, much narrower than the government had hoped for. It was nowhere near the kind of majority that would justify sending the bill on to the House of Commons, where the political conditions would almost certainly produce a much closer vote, and where defeat was quite possible. The Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, on receiving the result of the vote, took the only sensible decision that the situation allowed. He announced on the floor of the House of Lords, immediately after the vote was completed, that the government would not be pursuing the bill any further. The bill would not be sent to the Commons. It was, in effect, withdrawn. The proceeding was over. The Queen had not been formally deprived of her position. The marriage had not been dissolved. The various charges, although they had not been formally rejected, had been allowed to lapse without conclusion. The reaction in London, when the news became public, was one of extraordinary popular celebration. The crowds that had been waiting outside the House of Lords throughout the day of the vote erupted into the kind of mass joy that the country had not seen since the celebrations of the victories at Waterloo 5 years earlier. The various church bells of London were rung, in many parishes, in defiance of any official orders to the contrary. The streets of the city were, throughout the night of the 10th of November, filled with people walking and shouting and embracing strangers. Various houses were illuminated in the conventional manner of the period, with candles in the windows to mark the celebration. The houses of those who had been on the wrong side of the proceedings, including various of the king's ministers, were attacked by stone-throwing crowds and had their windows broken. The newspapers, on the morning of the 11th of November, carried reports of the celebrations that ran to many columns of detailed description. That was the tick. Caroline herself at Brandenburg House received the news of the withdrawal of the bill with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She had borne throughout the months of the trial with the kind of quiet courage that had characterized her conduct since her arrival in England in June. She had been subjected, day after day, to the most intimate and the most embarrassing public examination. She had heard in open court the testimony of former servants describing the most private aspects of her own life. She had been throughout the central public spectacle of the country, with all the strain that that position carried. She was, by the time the trial ended, 52 years old, and the toll on her health had been considerable. She would never fully recover from it, but, in the immediate aftermath of the verdict, she was, undeniably, the heroine of the country. The popular celebrations continued, in various forms, for several weeks. There were addresses presented to her from various public bodies and various community groups, congratulating her on her vindication and assuring her of their continued support. There were dinners held in her honour. There were poems written about her. There was in the political sphere a distinct sense among the Whig opposition that her cause had become, in the public mind, a cause for the broader reform of the British political system, and that the popular movement that had supported her could be channeled, in due course, into the various political reforms that the Whigs had been advocating. This last hope, however, would prove to be more complicated than it appeared in the immediate aftermath of the verdict. The popular support for Caroline, although intense, was in many respects more focused on her as a person than on any specific political program. The various reform movements that hoped to use her cause as a vehicle for broader change found over the following months that the popular enthusiasm did not necessarily translate into specific political mobilization. The country had, in a sense, won its victory in the failure of the bill. The popular momentum, although it remained considerable for several months, gradually diffused, as such movements tend to do, into a more general but less politically focused popular feeling. The months that followed the withdrawal of the bill, between November of 1820 and the summer of 1821, were a strange period of provisional triumph for Caroline of Brunswick. She remained, formally, Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. She had not been deprived, by the failure of the bill, of any of the formal rights that her position carried. She had every right, in the months following her vindication, to expect that her position would now, in some practical sense, be regularized. The actual situation, however, was considerably more complicated than the formal position suggested. Her husband, the king, although he had been forced to abandon the bill, had not in any way reconciled himself to her existence. He continued throughout these months to refuse to acknowledge her in any public capacity. He continued to refuse to allow her to be received at court. He continued to refuse to permit her name to be included in the prayers of the Church of England, which was, by ancient convention, the right of every Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. He continued, in every small way that his still considerable powers permitted, to make her position as Queen as practically restricted as it could be made, while not formally abolishing it. The country, meanwhile, was beginning, slowly, to lose interest in the various small ongoing skirmishes of the royal marriage. The intense popular engagement that had been the dominant fact of the autumn of 1820 had begun, by the spring of 1821, to give way to other concerns. the economy continued to be in difficulty. The various political reform movements were continuing their own work. The day-to-day attention of the country was no longer, as it had been during the trial, fixed almost entirely on the conduct of the Queen. There was, however, one further confrontation that everyone knew was coming. The coronation of King George IV had been postponed throughout the period of the trial, on the practical grounds that conducting a coronation while the king was attempting to divorce his wife was not politically feasible. With the trial now concluded, the coronation could be scheduled. The date that was eventually set was the 19th of July, 1821. The question of whether the Queen would attend the coronation, and in what capacity, became, in the months leading up to the date, one of the central political questions of the country. The Queen was, by every constitutional precedent, entitled to attend her husband's coronation and to be crowned alongside him as Queen Consort. There were specific ceremonies prepared in the formal coronation ritual that were designed to be performed for the Queen. There were specific honours by ancient custom that were due to her on the day. The king, however, was determined that none of these ceremonies should be performed and honours should be paid. He instructed his ministers throughout the spring and early summer of 1821 that the Queen should be excluded from the coronation altogether. Caroline, on receiving the various indications of the king's intentions, decided that she would attend the coronation in any case. She would not allow herself to be passively excluded from her own husband's crowning. If the various official channels for her attendance were closed to her, she would attend by other means. She would, if necessary, present herself at Westminster Abbey on the morning of the coronation and demand admission as the Queen Consort. She would, in the broadest sense, force the question of her exclusion onto the most public possible stage. This decision, announced in the weeks before the coronation, produced a wave of frantic activity on both sides. The king's ministers, alarmed at the prospect of a public confrontation at the Abbey on the day of the coronation, attempted, through various intermediaries, to negotiate a settlement under which Caroline would, in exchange for various financial considerations, agree to absent herself from the ceremony. Caroline rejected these proposals. The king's officials at the Abbey were instructed to make detailed preparations for her exclusion, which would, if she insisted on attending, have to be physically enforced at the various entrances. Various of the constabulary forces of London were detailed to be present, in considerable numbers, on the route between the Queen's residence and the Abbey, in case her attempt to attend produced disturbances of public order. The morning of the 19th of July 1821 was warm and humid. The streets of London around the Abbey were full of crowds from the early hours of the morning. The various peers and dignitaries who were attending the coronation were arriving from before dawn in the formal regalia of their various positions. The Abbey itself was being prepared in the conventional manner for the elaborate sequence of ceremonies that had been prescribed for the day. The atmosphere in the streets and around the Abbey was a strange mixture of public excitement and political tension. Caroline, that morning, set out from Brandenburg House in a carriage that had been prepared for her use. She was accompanied by Lord Hood, who had been one of her most loyal supporters throughout the various proceedings of the previous year, and by various other attendants. She was dressed in a coronation robe that had been prepared in the previous weeks by her own dressmakers in the conventional design of a Queen Consort's coronation dress. She was wearing, in her hair, a small diadem that had been made for her use. She was, by every account of those who saw her that morning, deeply nervous but determined to proceed. The carriage made its way slowly through the crowds to the Abbey. It arrived at one of the entrances, where she descended and approached, with Lord Hood at her side, the door. The official at the door, who had been instructed in advance, asked for her ticket of admission. She did not have one. She presented herself instead as the Queen, claiming admission by right. The official replied with considerable embarrassment that he had been instructed to admit no person without a ticket, and that he could not make any exception. Lord Hood, on her behalf, demanded that she be admitted as the queen. The official, not raising his voice, responded again that he had no authority to admit anyone without a ticket. The exchange continued, with various other officials becoming involved for several minutes. Caroline, with what was, by every account of those who witnessed it, considerable dignity, then turned and walked with Lord Hood to another of the entrances. The same exchange was conducted there. She was again refused admission. She walked, then, to a third entrance. The same. To a fourth. The same. At one of the entrances, by some of the contemporary accounts, the door was actually shut in her face by a constable. At another, she was advised by an official that she might consider returning to her carriage and retiring from the scene. She did not retire. She walked with Lord Hood around the abbey, attempting one entrance after another, in front of the assembled crowds, in the morning sunlight, in her coronation robe, in front of the country. The crowds, who had filled the streets around the abbey in their tens of thousands, watched this whole performance with a mixture of feelings that were, by the various accounts that have survived, considerably more complicated than the simple sympathy of the previous year. Some of them shouted in her favour. Some of them, by some of the reports, shouted against her. Many of them stood in silence, watching what was in its essentials the public humiliation of a woman who had once been their heroine. The political mood had shifted. The intense popular engagement of 1820 had, by July of 1821, dissipated to the point where Caroline could no longer rely, automatically, on the kind of popular support that had been her strength during the trial. She was still popular. She was no longer by any means universally popular, and the spectacle of her trying door after door to enter a coronation from which she had been formally excluded was not the kind of spectacle that the public could watch with comfort. Eventually, after several attempts at several different entrances, Caroline accepted that admission would not be granted. She returned, with Lord Hood, to her carriage. She drove away from the abbey, through the crowds, back to Brandenburg House. The coronation, inside the abbey, proceeded without her. The king, throughout the long ceremony, made no reference to his wife. The various peers and dignitaries who had been present at the proceedings outside the abbey returned to their seats and proceeded with their formal duties as if nothing had happened. The crowning of King George IV was performed. In due course, in the conventional manner. He was anointed, he was crowned, he was acknowledged. The various processions and ceremonies that followed the coronation were conducted without his queen. The day of the coronation was, by any honest account, the most painful single day of Caroline's entire life. She had been, throughout the previous decade, and especially the previous 12 months, subjected to a great many indignities. She had been investigated, accused, tried, mocked, slandered. She had endured with what was on balance considerable courage the various proceedings that had been brought against her. But the experience of the coronation morning, the experience of walking from door to door of Westminster Abbey in her coronation robe in front of the assembled public, being turned away at each one, was an experience of public humiliation that was, in its specific form and its specific circumstances, almost without precedent in the history of European royalty. She returned to Brandenburg House that evening in a state of profound emotional and physical distress that was visible to everyone who saw her. She did not, in the days that followed, recover. The illness that took Caroline of Brunswick in the weeks after the coronation was rapid and severe. She had complained in the days immediately following the 19th of July of various symptoms that her physicians had initially treated as relatively minor. She had pain in her abdomen. She had loss of appetite. She had general weakness and a degree of mental distress that her attendants attributed to the events of the coronation day. By the end of July, however, the symptoms had worsened considerably. The pain had become severe. She was unable to keep down food or even water. She was, by the early days of August, clearly in the kind of decline that the medicine of the period could not arrest. The exact nature of her illness has been the subject of various subsequent medical analyses. The most likely explanation, given the symptoms that her physicians recorded, was an obstruction of the bowel, possibly caused by an underlying cancerous condition that had been developing for some time. The treatments that were available to her physicians in 1821 were extremely limited. There was no surgical intervention that could be undertaken. There were no medications that could relieve the obstruction. The various calomel preparations and various opium preparations that the physicians administered were of no real benefit. Caroline, throughout the early days of August, became progressively weaker in pain that was, by the various accounts of those who attended her, considerable. She was, however, conscious throughout most of her illness. She made, during these days, certain dispositions of her affairs. She made a will which left her property to her Italian companion Bartolomeo Pergami's daughter Vittorina, in a final acknowledgement of the relationship that had been the central emotional fact of her later years. She wrote, by way of dictation to her attendants, a final letter to her brother in Brunswick, expressing her regret at the various misunderstandings of her life and her hope for some kind of reconciliation in the world to come. She received on the evening of the 6th of August the formal sacraments of the Anglican Church in a ceremony that was conducted at her bedside by an Anglican clergyman. She died in the early hours of the morning of the 7th of August, 1821. She was 53 years old. The various attendants and friends who had been with her throughout the final days reported that she had died in considerable peace, having reconciled herself to the various losses and disappointments of her life, and having maintained, until the last hours, the kind of essential warmth that had been the most attractive feature of her personality from her earliest years. The news of her death, when it became public on the morning of the 7th of August, produced in London a wave of public emotion that was, in its own way, almost as intense as the celebrations that had followed the verdict in the trial 9 months earlier. The various church bells of London were tolled. The various theatres of the city were closed for the evening in mourning. The newspapers carried, throughout the following days, extended biographical and political reflections on her life and her significance. The funeral arrangements, which had to be made within the next few days, were the subject of considerable political controversy. The king and his ministers, who were anxious to avoid any further popular demonstrations in connection with the Queen, wished to have her body removed from the country with the minimum possible public ceremony. Caroline herself, in her last days, had requested that her body should be buried in Brunswick, in the family vault of her ancestors. The government, on receiving this information, decided that the body should be transported as quietly as possible to Brunswick for burial. The route of the funeral procession through London was specified by the government in such a way as to avoid the most populous parts of the city, where popular demonstrations would be most likely. The funeral procession, which set out from Brandenburg House on the morning of the 14th of August 1821, did not, however, proceed in the way that the government had planned. The crowds that had assembled along the original route refused to allow the procession to take the alternative streets that the government had chosen. They blocked the route. They forced the procession back onto the main streets through the heart of the city. There were, in the course of these confrontations, various clashes between the crowds and the troops who had been detailed to escort the procession. There were several deaths. There were many injuries. By the end of the day, the procession had proceeded through London by the route that the crowds had insisted on, and had arrived at Harwich on the East Anglian coast, where the ship that was to carry the body to the continent was waiting. The body was embarked. The ship sailed on the morning of the 16th of August for Stade in Hanover. From there, the body was transported by various stages to Brunswick, where it was buried, in accordance with Caroline's wishes, in the family vault of her ancestors. The funeral in Brunswick was conducted by her brother the Duke, and was attended by the various surviving members of her German family. It was a quiet and dignified affair, in considerable contrast to the public turbulence of the procession through London. There is one detail of her burial that I want to mention, because it is a small but striking expression of how she chose to be remembered. The inscription that was placed on her coffin by her own pre-arranged instructions read, in Latin, Caroline of Brunswick, the injured Queen of England. The choice of the word injured in this final inscription was a quiet but unmistakable assertion of her version of her own story. She did not describe herself on her coffin as the Queen of England, with the various ceremonial flourishes that the position would normally have called for. She described herself as the injured Queen of England, with the implication made permanent on her coffin lid that her story was the story of an injury done to her by the country she had married into, and by the husband who had been responsible for the injury throughout the long years of their marriage. This inscription, when its content became known to the king in London, was reported to have caused him considerable annoyance. He had hoped, by the various measures that had been taken to keep the funeral arrangements quiet, to bring the whole story of his wife to a final close with the minimum possible public reflection. He had hoped that her death would, in the broadest sense, allow him to start fresh, with a new political and personal landscape that was no longer dominated by her presence. The inscription on her coffin was a final reminder, from beyond the grave, that the story she had told about her own life would continue to be told, in her own words, by her own choice, regardless of what the king in London might have preferred. I want to spend, before we draw the evening to a close, some time on what the Caroline affair actually meant in the longer arc of British political and social history, because the particular events of her life, although they are dramatic enough on their own terms, are also significant for various broader reasons, and the long shadow that the Caroline affair cast over the British monarchy and the British political system is a subject that deserves at least some reflection. The most immediate consequence of the affair was the further damage it did to the personal reputation of King George IV. He had, before the trial began, been one of the least popular sovereigns in modern British history. He emerged from the trial with his reputation in even worse condition. The various aspects of his own conduct that had been exposed in the course of the proceedings were not the kind of aspects that any sovereign would have wished to have publicly examined. The vast extravagance of his court, the various mistresses, the financial recklessness, the complete absence of any genuine attempt to make the marriage with Caroline work, all of this had been, throughout the months of the trial, the constant background to the proceedings against his wife. The country, in considering the conduct of the Queen, could not avoid the king, and the king in this comparison came off considerably worse than the woman he was attempting to depose. He continued, throughout the remainder of his reign, to be a ruler whose personal conduct was the source of constant public dissatisfaction. He died in 1830 of various complications related to his lifelong habits of indulgence, having reigned for 10 years and having achieved in those years almost nothing of permanent constructive consequence. He was succeeded by his brother, the former Duke of Clarence, who became William IV, and who proved, in his own different way, a considerably more effective and considerably more popular sovereign than his elder brother had been. By 1837, when William IV in turn died, the British monarchy was being inherited by the 18-year-old Princess Victoria, whose own long reign would, in many ways, be conducted in conscious reaction against the various failings of the late Hanoverian period. The constitutional and ceremonial dignity of the monarchy, which had been so badly damaged by the Caroline affair and by the various other scandals of George IV's reign, would have to be reconstructed, painstakingly and slowly, by the new generation that succeeded him. The Caroline affair also had longer-term consequences for the relationship between the monarchy and the popular press. The intense newspaper engagement of the trial had established, in a way that had not been quite so true before, the principle that the private conduct of the royal family was a matter of legitimate public interest. The newspapers, having reported the various details of the Queen's continental conduct and of the King's marital arrangements, did not subsequently revert to the kind of deferential silence that had been characteristic of pre-1820 royal coverage. The principle that the personal lives of the royal family could be reported and discussed and even ridiculed in print had been established in 1820 and would not be unestablished thereafter. The various subsequent royal scandals of the 19th and 20th centuries, in their press treatment, owed something to the precedents that had been set in the autumn of 1820. The political consequences for the various parties involved in the trial were considerable in some cases, and less so in others. Henry Brougham, who had conducted Caroline's defence with such brilliance, became, in the years after the trial, one of the dominant figures of the Whig opposition. He went on to serve eventually as Lord Chancellor in the Whig government of the early 1830s, and he was, throughout the great reform debates of that period, one of the most important political figures in the country. His defence of Caroline had established his reputation, and the popular support that he had generated through the trial gave him a political base that he used effectively for the next decade. The various Whig politicians who had supported Caroline throughout the trial, including in particular Alderman Wood and various others, also benefited politically from their association with her cause. The Whig Party, which had been in opposition for most of the previous several decades, found in the popular movement that had supported Caroline the kind of popular base that they could use as the foundation for the great reform campaigns of the late 1820s and early 1830s. The Reform Act of 1832, which fundamentally restructured the British electoral system, was the political consequence, in some ways, of the popular mobilisation that had begun with the Queen Caroline affair. For Lord Liverpool's Tory government, by contrast, the consequences of the affair were largely negative. The Prime Minister, who had warned the King throughout against pursuing the divorce, was vindicated in his judgment by the failure of the bill, but the political costs of the proceeding fell, in considerable part, on his government. The various ministers who had been associated with the prosecution case, including in particular the Lord Chancellor and the Attorney General, lost public reputation as a result of the trial. The government's general political position, which had been weak throughout the years following the war, was further weakened by the affair, and the slow decline of Tory political dominance, which would culminate in the Great Reform period of the 1830s, was accelerated by the various consequences of the trial. For the women of Britain, in particular, the Caroline affair had a complicated significance that has been the subject of considerable feminist historical analysis in recent decades. Caroline's case had been, in many respects, an unusually visible example of the kind of marital unfairness that the laws and customs of the period imposed on married women in general. She had been forced into a marriage she did not choose. She had been mistreated by her husband from the first moment. She had been separated, against her will, from her own daughter. She had been investigated, on the basis of malicious gossip, by a secret commission. She had been brought to trial, on charges of adultery, by a husband whose own adulteries had been considerably more numerous and considerably more public than anything alleged against her. She had been in every meaningful respect a victim of the systematic legal and social subordination of married women that the period maintained. The popular support for Caroline in 1820 included a considerable element of women's support that was, in retrospect, an early manifestation of broader feminist sentiment. The various addresses that were presented to her during the trial included a particularly striking address from the women of London, which was signed by tens of thousands of women and which expressed, in language that was unusually direct for the period, a sense of solidarity with her position and a recognition that her case represented, in some sense, the case of married women generally. The various subsequent feminist movements of the 19th century, in their early intellectual development, drew on the various themes that the Caroline affair had crystallized. The reform of the marriage laws, which would be a slow and partial process throughout the rest of the century, owed something to the public attention that the Caroline trial had drawn to the unfair treatment of married women. For Caroline herself as a personal historical figure, the long verdict of history has been considerably more sympathetic than the immediate verdict of her husband and his ministers. The various 19th century historians who wrote about her tended, in the main, to be condescending. They acknowledged her popular support, but tended to suggest that her personal conduct had been, in various respects, undignified. They emphasized, often more than the evidence justified, the various aspects of her behavior that had been considered eccentric or vulgar. They tended to portray her as in essence a comic figure of dubious propriety who had been raised to political importance by the unfortunate circumstances of her marriage, rather than as the substantial historical figure that she had, in various ways, been. The historiography of the late 20th and 21st centuries has been considerably more balanced. The various detailed studies of the Caroline affair that have appeared in recent decades have tended to give her credit for the considerable personal qualities that she possessed, and to recognize the systematic injustices that she suffered, and to place her in the broader history of the period as a more complicated and more sympathetic figure than the contemporary judgments of her enemies allowed her to be. She was not, by any reasonable standard, a perfect person. She was also, in various respects, a more substantial figure than the simple narrative of her victimhood might suggest. She was a person of genuine warmth and genuine generosity, who had managed, in the various households she ran throughout her life, to create environments in which the people around her, particularly the children and the dependents, were treated with kindness. She was a person of physical and moral courage, who had, in various decisive moments of her life, taken risks that more cautious people would have avoided. She was a person of considerable intellectual liveliness, despite the inadequacies of her formal education, who had read widely throughout her life, and who had been, in her conversation, capable of considerable insight when she was not engaged in the various indiscretions that her temperament also produced. She was, in short, a real person of considerable interest, and the strange fate that had placed her at the centre of the most spectacular royal scandal of the early 19th century did not prevent her from being, in her own right, a worthwhile and substantial human being. I want, before we close, to take you back to a particular evening in the autumn of 1820, in the middle of the trial, and to give you a sense of what it was actually like to be in London during those weeks. Because the broad outlines of the political and legal proceedings are one thing, but the actual texture of the city during those months, the small daily details of how the trial played out in the lived experience of people who had no direct connection to it, is something that is worth attempting to reconstruct. Imagine, then, an evening in late October of 1820. The trial has been going on for 6 weeks. The defence case is in progress. London is in the middle of one of those autumns where the weather has turned cold and damp early, and the streets are wet, and the lamps in the shop windows have been lit by the middle of the afternoon. The various people who have been attending the trial all day have, by 6 in the evening, dispersed to their various clubs and houses and lodgings to discuss what they have heard. In the various coffee houses of the city, the trial is the only subject of conversation. The newspapers, with their detailed reports of the day's proceedings, are passed from hand to hand. Various men, in their evening suits, sit in the booths with their friends and discuss the various witnesses, the various items of testimony, the various ways in which the legal arguments have shifted in the course of the day. The opinions, although they vary in detail, run in the great majority against the king and in favour of the queen. The various small details of the prosecution's case are picked over with the kind of attention that any spectacular legal proceeding generates among an attentive public. In the various private houses of the West End, the same conversations are taking place at the dinner tables, although in slightly different terms. The aristocratic society of the city, which has been divided throughout the trial in its loyalties, conducts its evening discussions with a degree of careful indirection that public coffeehouse conversation does not require. Various of the great Whig families have made themselves into outright partisans of the Queen, and their dinner tables echo with declarations of support and with denunciations of the King's behaviour. Various of the great Tory families, by contrast, have remained loyal to the King's cause, although their loyalty has been considerably tested by the various aspects of the proceeding that they find difficult to defend. The various political families who have been trying to remain neutral in the hope of preserving their positions whatever the eventual outcome, conduct their dinners in considerable awkwardness, with the trial being the constant unspoken subject around which their conversation revolves. In the working-class districts of the city, the East End and Southwark, and the various poorer parts of the West, the popular support for the Queen runs at a different temperature. The various pubs and beer-houses are full, throughout these weeks, of men and women who are intensely engaged in the case, and who feel, in a way that the more genteel parts of the city do not feel quite so directly, that the proceedings are about something more than just the personal affairs of the royal family. They feel that the trial is in some sense a contest between the various forces of arbitrary power, on the one hand represented by the King and his ministers, and the various forces of popular justice on the other hand, represented by the Queen and her supporters. The popular songs that are sung in the pubs of these districts throughout the trial are explicitly political. They abuse the King and his mistresses. They celebrate the Queen and her courage. They make connections, often not particularly subtle ones, between the Queen's case and the various other political grievances of the period. The mood in these districts is genuinely revolutionary in a way that has not been seen since the early years of the French Revolution. The political authorities are aware of this mood and are, throughout the months of the trial, considerably more anxious about the possibility of serious public disorder than the polite drawing rooms of the West End are aware of. In the various theatres and entertainment venues of the city, the trial has worked its way into the cultural life of the period in various ways. The Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, which has been, by long tradition, one of the principal cultural establishments of the city, is, throughout the autumn of 1820, packed every evening with audiences who have come not just to see the various plays that are being performed, but to participate in the popular political mood that the trial has created. The various comic and political references that the actors are able to insert into their performances, by way of small additions to the scripts, are received with cheers and laughter that have, in their substance, very little to do with the actual content of the plays. The various managers of the theatres, anxious about the possibility of being closed down by the authorities for political reasons, exercise some restraint, but the political atmosphere finds its way onto the stage in various indirect ways, and the audiences leave the theatres every evening in a state of considerable political agitation. In the various small bookshops and stationery shops of the city, the demand for the various pamphlets and caricatures and printed materials of the trial is, throughout these weeks, beyond anything that the printers and booksellers have ever known. The various famous caricaturists of the period, including in particular George Cruikshank and his various competitors, are producing new prints almost every day, in editions of thousands of copies that sell out within hours of being placed in the shop windows. The various political pamphlets, by writers who range from the most distinguished political journalists of the period to the most disreputable hack scribblers, are being printed and reprinted in volumes that the trade has no real recent precedent for. The various theological and moral commentaries on the situation by clergymen of various denominations are also being printed and read in considerable quantities, although these tend to be more divided in their political positions than the more populist material. This is the city in the autumn of 1820. London at the centre of one of the most consuming public dramas in its modern history. Every coffee house, every dinner table, every theatre, every shop, every pub, every street corner, full of the same conversation, the same arguments, the same shared engagement in the most intimate details of the marital affairs of two people who, by any reasonable measure, were a great deal less interesting in themselves than the popular attention they were receiving suggested. The country had become for these months a country united in its attention to a single drama, in a way that has very few parallels in any subsequent period of British history. The arrival of mass political consciousness, which historians have traditionally located in the various reform movements of the 1830s and 1840s, can in some respects be traced back to these months in 1820, when the entire country was engaged daily in following the course of a public proceeding whose outcome they all felt themselves to have a stake in. The exhaustion of this engagement, when it eventually came, was considerable. By the end of the trial, in November of 1820, the country had been at this pitch of attention for so many months that the immediate aftermath of the verdict was followed by a kind of collective decompression, with many people simply unable to sustain, into the spring of 1821, the level of political engagement that the trial had generated. This is part of the reason, although not the whole reason, why the popular support for Caroline at the coronation in July of 1821 was less unified and less universal than it had been at the verdict 9 months earlier. The country had moved on in a way that the Queen herself had not, and the dynamics that had supported her cause through the autumn of 1820 had, by the summer of 1821, considerably weakened. But for those months, in the autumn of 1820, London had been the centre of a kind of political engagement that the country had not seen before, and would not see again for many years. The Caroline affair, in this sense, was not just a royal scandal. It was a moment of national political consciousness, a moment when the country, for various complicated reasons, found itself engaged at every level in the same single drama. The historians who have studied the affair carefully have in recent decades increasingly recognized that the political and cultural significance of those months extended considerably beyond the immediate question of whether the Queen would be deprived of her position. The Caroline affair, in its full historical context, was a turning point in the broader political development of the country, and the various consequences of the affair continued to ripple through British political and cultural life for decades afterward. I want to spend a few minutes before we close with one particular figure who deserves to be held in mind alongside Caroline herself, because the story of Caroline of Brunswick, although it is in the broadest sense her own story, is also in important ways the story of the people who supported her, and one figure in particular, Henry Brougham, played a role in her life that I think deserves a moment of attention. Henry Brougham, who became in the years after Caroline's death the first Baron Brougham and Vock, was, at the time of the trial in 1820, 42 years old. He was a Scottish-born barrister who had built, over the previous 15 years, one of the most formidable legal practices in the country. He was, by general agreement, the most brilliant cross-examiner of his generation. He was also, in his political life, one of the most prominent Whig members of the House of Commons, and he had been for many years an ally and advisor to Caroline of Brunswick in her various legal and political difficulties. Brougham had taken up Caroline's cause initially in 1812 when she had first consulted him about the various complications of her position. He had, throughout the years that followed, served her in various capacities, both as a legal advisor and as a political ally. He had been one of the principal architects of her defence in the parliamentary trial of 1820, and the brilliance of his performance in that trial, particularly in the cross-examination of the prosecution witnesses, had been the principal reason, in the immediate sense, for the failure of the bill. The relationship between Brougham and Caroline, however, was more complicated than the simple description of a brilliant lawyer defending a worthy client. Brougham had, throughout the years of his involvement with her, been pursuing his own political agenda, in which the cause of the Queen was, in important respects, a vehicle for his own broader ambitions. He had used the popular movement that supported her throughout the trial to build his own political reputation. He had not at various points been entirely scrupulous in his handling of her affairs. He had, on at least one significant occasion, sat on a confidential letter from the king's ministers that contained a generous settlement offer to her, in circumstances where his own political interests were better served by allowing the trial to proceed than by encouraging her to accept the offer. These complications of Brougham's relationship with Caroline have been the subject of considerable historical debate. The most recent and most authoritative biographies of him have tended to be more critical of his conduct than the earlier hagiographic accounts, and have argued, with what is, I think, considerable justice, that he treated his client, in various respects, less than ideally. He was, in his way, a brilliant defender. He was also, in his way, a man whose own self-interest sometimes overrode the interests of the woman whose cause he was supposedly serving. Caroline herself, in her later years, became aware of various of these complications. The relationship between her and Brougham, although it remained outwardly cordial, was strained, in the months after the trial, by various small disagreements about the conduct of her affairs. By the time of her death in August of 1821, she had developed, by the various accounts of her intimates, a degree of disillusion with Brougham that the formal relations between them had not entirely concealed. He had been, throughout her trial, the most important single ally she had. He had not been, by any rigorous standard, an entirely faithful one. The complexity of this relationship is part of what makes the Caroline affair, in its full historical detail, more interesting than the simple narrative of heroic defense and unjust persecution that the most popular versions of the story sometimes suggest. Brougham himself, for the rest of his long life, would carry the memory of his association with Caroline as one of the most important and most controversial achievements of his career. He served, as I have mentioned, as Lord Chancellor in the Whig government of 1830 to 1834. He was a major figure in the various reform debates of the 1830s. He continued, after his withdrawal from active politics in the late 1830s, to be a prominent public figure, lecturing and writing on various legal and social subjects until his death in 1868 at the age of nearly 90. He outlived by many decades the woman whose cause he had defended in 1820, and he was, in his own way, one of the principal vehicles by which the memory of the Caroline affair was carried forward into the later 19th century. The other figures in Caroline's story, taken in the broader sense, also deserve at least a passing mention. Bartolomeo Pagani, the Italian companion who had been at the centre of the various accusations, returned, after Caroline's death, to his estate in northern Italy. He lived a quiet life on his Italian properties, in considerable comfort, on the various financial provisions that Caroline had made for him in her will and during her lifetime. He died in 1842, at the age of 55, having survived his patroness by 21 years. He never spoke publicly, in the years after Caroline's death, about the various aspects of his relationship with her that had been the subject of the trial. He maintained, throughout his remaining years, the kind of dignified silence that the situation called for, and his various private letters and papers, which have been studied by Italian historians, suggest that his affection for Caroline was genuine, and that the relationship, whatever its precise nature had been, for both parties, a source of real personal happiness. His daughter, Vittorina Pagani, who had been in effect raised in Caroline's household, and who was, by the terms of Caroline's will, the principal beneficiary of her estate, lived a long and prosperous life in Italy, marrying well and dying at an advanced age in the late 19th century. Her descendants, in the various Italian families into which she married, continued, into the 20th century, to be aware of their connection to the dramatic English royal scandal of 3 generations earlier, and the various Pagani papers that have survived in their possession have been an important source for the modern historical analysis of the Caroline affair. William Austin, the small boy whose presence in Caroline's household had been the trigger for the delicate investigation of 1806, lived a long but troubled life. He had, throughout his upbringing, considered Caroline to be effectively his mother, and her death in 1821 was for him the loss of the most important person in his life. He suffered in his adult years from various forms of mental illness that the medicine of the period could not effectively treat. He spent considerable periods of his later life in private institutions for the care of the mentally ill. He died in 1849 at the age of 47, having outlived his patroness by 28 years. The various provisions that Caroline had made for him in her will were, by the standards of the period, generous, and they ensured that he was at least financially provided for throughout his various difficulties. But he had, in the broadest sense, been one of the various incidental casualties of the strange life that had unfolded around the woman who had, with her customary indiscriminate kindness, taken him in as an infant in 1802. Caroline's daughter, Princess Charlotte, who had died in childbirth in November of 1817, had been throughout the years before her death the central emotional fact of her mother's life. The various reflections that Caroline made during her continental years about her absent daughter were, in their substance, among the most moving documents of the entire scandal. She wrote in various of her letters from Italy of her dreams of Princess Charlotte, of her hopes for an eventual reunion, of her grief that the various political circumstances had separated them so completely. The news of Princess Charlotte's death, when it reached Caroline in Italy in late November of 1817, had been, by the various accounts of her intimates, the heaviest blow she ever received. She had been alone, in a foreign country, surrounded by people who did not really know her when the news arrived. She had been, by the accounts of those present, in such a state of grief that she could not be left alone for several days. She had lost with the death of her daughter the only person in the world who had loved her unconditionally throughout the various humiliations and difficulties of her own life. That grief, although it did not break her, marked her permanently. The various accounts of her conduct in the years between 1817 and 1820 suggest that she was, after the death of Princess Charlotte, a person who had less to lose than she had had before. The willingness with which she undertook, in the spring of 1820, the dangerous return to England, the willingness with which she submitted herself to the various humiliations of the trial, the willingness with which she persisted, despite the various warnings and discouragements, in her insistence on her own rights as queen. All of this was made possible, in considerable part, by the fact that the central emotional commitment of her life had already been removed. She had, after her daughter's death, very little more to lose. She acted, throughout the final phase of her life, with the kind of courage that is sometimes available to people who have already lost the thing that mattered most to them. Let me close, before we finish, with one final image, because in all the various names and dates and political details that we have walked through tonight, there is one specific scene that, for me, captures something essential about Caroline of Brunswick, and I would like to leave you with it. The scene is set, not in London or in Brunswick or in Naples, but in the small Italian coastal town of Pesaro in the autumn of 1817. Caroline is then 49 years old. She has been on the continent for 3 years. She has not, in those 3 years, been particularly happy, although she has been, in the way that her temperament made characteristic, generally cheerful. She has been living with Bartolomeo Pagani and his various relatives at the Villa Vittoria. She has been conducting the kind of moderately eccentric life that her position has made possible. She has been receiving in her household various visitors from England and from Italy, conducting various small charitable activities in the town and the surrounding countryside, and writing the various long letters home that have been, throughout her years on the continent, her principal connection to her own past. On a particular evening in late November of 1817, a letter arrives from England. It has been forwarded through the various postal arrangements of the period from her brother in Brunswick, who has himself received it from London. It is a letter that informs her of the death of her daughter, Princess Charlotte, in the childbirth that has, for the rest of her life, become one of the central tragedies of her existence. She reads the letter by candlelight in a small room in the Villa Vittoria. She is in that moment alone. She does not, in the immediate moments after reading the letter, call for any of her attendants. She does not weep in the conventional sense. She sits in her chair by the candle with the letter on the table in front of her, and she looks out, through the window, into the Italian dark. What she is thinking in those moments has not been recorded. There are no eyewitnesses. There is no contemporary account of what she said or did in the hour or so after reading the letter. The various reports that we have of her grief begin only in the days that followed, when her household became aware of what had happened and began to make the various arrangements that the situation required. But I want to put you, for a moment, in that small Italian room with her, the candle on the table, the letter in her brother's handwriting with its terrible news, the window with the Italian night beyond it, the 50-year-old woman, alone, learning that her only child has died. She had been, throughout her life, a person of warmth and energy and indiscretion. She had been, throughout her marriage, the victim of a husband who never wanted her. She had been, throughout the recent years on the continent, on a kind of long extended escape from a country that had given her almost nothing but unhappiness. She had had, throughout it all, one person who had loved her completely, and that person had been her daughter, who was now, by the news in the letter, gone forever. That moment, the moment of reading the letter, was, in some ways, the actual end of Caroline's emotional life. The various dramas that followed, the trial, the verdict, the coronation, the final illness, were all in some sense the postscript to her life rather than the substance of it. The substance of her life had, in that small moment in an Italian villa, come to an end. The various subsequent events, although they were dramatic and historically significant, were the actions of a woman who had already lost what mattered most to her. That is, I think, the heart of Caroline's story. Not the spectacular trial in the House of Lords, not the cheering crowds in the streets of London, not the famous cross-examinations and the famous speeches. Those were, for the country, the great public drama. For Caroline herself, the central event of her life had been the loss of the daughter she had loved through every difficulty of their separation, and the various subsequent acts of her public life had been performed by a woman who was, in her deepest self, already in mourning. She died, in due course, in 1821, of the bowel obstruction or whatever it was that took her. She was buried in Brunswick with the inscription she had chosen for herself. She was missed by the few people who had loved her, and forgotten, more or less, by the wider country that had cheered her in 1820 and turned away from her in 1821. The various consequences of her case, although they were considerable in the long historical view, were not the things that she herself had cared about. She had cared in the end about the people who loved her. Her daughter had died. The rest of her life had been, in some sense, the working out of the implications of that single loss. This is, I think, the right note on which to leave her. Not the heroine of 1820, not the eccentric of the Continental years, not the ill-treated bride of 1795, just the woman, in the small Italian room, in the candlelight, reading the letter from her brother, with the news that the one person who had loved her unconditionally was gone. That moment is, in many ways, the quiet centre of her whole story, around which all the various public dramas eventually arranged themselves. She was, like all of us, a person whose public history was different from her private one. She was the centre of a great public scandal. She was also a woman who had lost her child. She was the heroine of a great public movement. She was, in the end, just a person, doing what she could in the situation she had been placed in, with the various qualities and various failings that any human being would have brought to such a situation. She is taken in this honest way, one of the most genuinely sympathetic figures of the entire Regency period, and her story, told without the various distortions that have so often accompanied it, is one of the most quietly moving stories that the period produced. So sleep well, wherever you are, with the various images of Caroline of Brunswick in your mind, the young princess in her German court, indiscreet and warm, the bride at St. James's Palace in 1795, encountering for the first time the man who would never love her, the mother at Blackheath, with her gathered children and her curious household, the traveller in Italy with her Italian companion and her growing sense of being, at last, in some kind of place that was hers, the accused in the House of Lords in the autumn of 1820, facing down the most powerful men in the country, with what was, in its way, considerable courage, the widow of her own daughter, in the candle-lit room in Pesaro, reading the letter from England, the woman, on the morning of the coronation, walking from door to door of Westminster Abbey in her coronation robe, being turned away at each one, the dying queen, in the bedroom at Brandenburg House, 3 weeks after the coronation, dictating her final letter to her brother. All of those are Caroline of Brunswick. All of those, taken together, are the woman whose story I have been telling you tonight. She is, in the end, neither the comic figure that her enemies made her out to be, nor the spotless heroine that her warmest defenders sometimes painted, but a more interesting and more substantial person than either of those caricatures allows. She was, in the ways that mattered, a real person, and her story, in the ways that mattered, is the story of a real life, with all its various textures and its various contradictions and its various small moments of warmth and pain and dignity. Good night from the Regency. Good night from the old House of Lords with its peers in their robes and its witnesses with their non miracordo. Good night from the streets of London in the autumn of 1820, with the cheering crowds and the broken windows. Good night from the small Italian villa in Pesaro, with the candle and the letter and the quiet woman who has just learned that her daughter is dead. Good night, most of all, from Caroline herself, who had, in her own peculiar way, more courage than her circumstances ever quite required of her, and who is remembered, today, more kindly than she was treated during her lifetime, which is, in the end, all that history can ever offer to those who needed kindness most when they were alive. The story in some form or other goes on. Sleep well.